This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. It was around 2 a.m., and I was restocking the coolers like I always do in the dead of night. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the empty store. Outside, darkness pressed against the windows. We're pretty far from town, surrounded by farmland and woods, so nighttime here feels especially eerie and isolating. I heard the bell chime as the door opened, which was unusual for that hour. Normally, we don't get many customers after midnight. I walked to the front ready to greet whoever had come in. That's when I saw him. A man, probably in his 40s, but it was hard to tell. His clothes were filthy and tattered, his hair matted and wild. But it was his eyes that really got to me. They were wide and feverish, darting around manically. He had this desperate, unhinged energy about him that immediately set me on edge. "Evening," I said cautiously. "Can I help you find anything?" He ignored me completely, stumbling through the aisles in an erratic pattern. I watched him warily as he grabbed an energy drink from the cooler. His movements were jerky and unpredictable. When he came to the counter to pay, I got a better look at him up close. His skin was sallow and clammy, dark circles under those wild eyes. He reeked of sweat and something else I couldn't identify. I tried to keep my hands from shaking as I rang him up. "That'll be $3.50, I said, forcing a polite smile. He slapped a crumpled $5 bill on the counter. As I was making change, he suddenly leaned in close. I could feel his hot, sour breath on my face. "You don't belong here," he rasped. I froze, unsure how to respond. "Excuse me? This place, it's not for you. They're coming, you know. They're always coming." His bloodshot eyes bored into mine. A chill ran down my spine. I needed to defuse this situation fast. "Sir, I'm just trying to do my job. Here's your change." As I held out the money, he grabbed my wrist in an iron grip. His hand was ice-cold and clammy. I tried to pull away, but he held firm. "Listen to me," he hissed. "You need to leave. It's not safe. They'll find you here." My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I glanced at the phone behind the counter, wondering if I could reach it to call 911. As if reading my mind, he yanked my arm, pulling me halfway across the counter. "Don't even think about it," he snarled. "You call anyone and it's over for you. You understand?" I nodded frantically, willing to say anything to get him to let go. Okay, I understand. Please, just take your drink and go." He held my gaze for what felt like an eternity, his grip painfully tight. Then, without warning, he released me and I stumbled backwards. "Remember what I said," he muttered, snatching up his energy drink. "They're coming, and when they do, you better not be here." With that, he lurched out of the store. The bell chimed again as the door swung shut behind him. I stood there frozen, my wrist throbbing where he'd grabbed me. Through the windows, I watched him disappear into the darkness beyond the fuel pumps. As soon as he was out of sight, I ran to lock the door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, my finger hovering over the call button. But something stopped me. What would I even say? That a creepy guy had come in and scared me? He hadn't actually done anything illegal. And what if he was still out there watching? His threat about calling anyone echoed in my mind. In the end, I didn't make the call. I spent the rest of my shift jumping at every little noise, convinced he was going to come back. But the night passed uneventfully. When my replacement arrived at 6 a.m., I practically ran out of there. I told my manager about the incident the next day. He brushed it off, saying it was probably just some druggie looking to score. He said I could take a day off if I needed it, but that was it. No offer to review security footage, no suggestion of filing a police report. It was clear he didn't take it seriously. But I can't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. The way that man looked at me, like he knew something I didn't. The urgency and fear in his voice when he told me to leave. And what did he mean by, "they're coming"? Who are they? I've gone back to work since then, but I'm constantly on edge. Every time the door opens, I expect to see him there. I've started checking the woods around the station with a flashlight, convinced I'll catch a glimpse of him lurking in the shadows. Sometimes I think I hear whispers on the wind, or see movement out of the corner of my eye. But when I look, there's nothing there. The worst part is, I can't stop thinking about what he said. That I don't belong here, that it's not safe. Part of me wants to quit this job and never look back. But another part of me is drawn to the mystery of it all. I want answers. I want to know what he knew. I'm writing this down partly to get it off my chest, and partly as a record in case something happens to me. I don't know if I'm in real danger, or if I'm just letting my imagination run wild. But I can't shake the feeling that something is coming. Something big and terrible, and I don't know if I'll be ready when it arrives. For now, all I can do is stay vigilant. I've started carrying pepper spray and a pocket knife. I installed a security app on my phone that lets me quickly send my location to emergency contacts. Maybe I'm being paranoid, but after that night, I don't think I can be too careful. If anyone has had a similar experience or has any insight into what this could mean, please let me know. I feel like I'm losing my mind here. Was this just a random encounter with a mentally unstable person? Or is there something more sinister at play? I don't know how much longer I can go on like this, jumping at shadows and seeing threats around every corner. One thing's for sure. I'll never look at the night shift the same way again. Every customer that walks in now is a potential threat. Every sound in the darkness could be him coming back. Or worse, it could be them, whoever or whatever he was warning me about. I just hope I figure out what's going on before it's too late. Because deep down, I have this sinking feeling that the clock is ticking, and when time runs out, I don't want to be anywhere near this gas station. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with my 3 closest friends, Ethan, Avery, and Thomas. We'd been planning this camping trip for weeks, excited to escape the city and enjoy some time in nature. We chose a pretty remote spot, about a 3-hour drive from town, and then another hour hiking in. The isolation was part of the appeal. No crowds, no cell service, just us and the wilderness. When we arrived at the campsite that afternoon, the weather was perfect. Warm summer sun, a light breeze rustling through the trees. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and spent the early evening hanging out by the campfire, grilling hot dogs and sharing stories and jokes. As the sun started to set, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks, I remember thinking how idyllic it all was. If only I'd known what was coming. It was fully dark by the time we crawled into our tents for the night. I was sharing with Ethan, while Avery and Thomas took the other tent. I drifted off to sleep pretty quickly, lulled by the sounds of crickets and the gentle wind in the trees. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up, but the fire had died down to embers and the woods were pitch black. At first I wasn't sure what had disturbed my sleep. Then I heard it, a twig snapping, leaves crunching. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer to our campsite. My heart started racing. Bears, a mountain lion. Some rational part of my brain tried to stay calm, but a primal fear was taking over. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, straining my ears. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard Ethan's voice, barely above a whisper. "Dude, do you see that?" I turned my head to look out the mesh window of our tent, and that's when I saw him. There was a man standing at the edge of our campsite, partially hidden behind a tree. But man doesn't quite describe what I saw. He was impossibly tall and thin, at least 7 feet. His skin was a sickly pale color that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. But it was his face that made my blood run cold. He had sunken, hollow cheeks and eyes that were just empty, black voids where eyes should be. And he was smiling, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched almost ear to ear. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just stared, paralyzed with fear, as this nightmarish figure stood motionless, watching us. He didn't say anything, didn't make a sound, just stood there with that horrifying grin, staring right at our tent. I have no idea how long we lay there, hardly daring to breathe. It felt like hours. Eventually, I must have passed out from sheer terror and exhaustion. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the tent. For a blissful moment, I thought maybe it had all been a nightmare. But then I saw Ethan's face. He looked like he hadn't slept a wink, eyes wide and haunted. Did you see?" I started to ask. He nodded grimly. "That fucking thing. Yeah, I saw it." We crawled out of the tent to find Avery and Thomas already up, looking just as shaken as we felt. They'd seen it too, watching their tent for what felt like hours before it finally vanished into the woods. We tried to rationalize it at first. Maybe it was just some weirdo trying to scare us. A hallucination brought on by bad mushrooms on our hot dogs. But deep down, we all knew whatever we'd seen wasn't human. Still, it was daylight now. We decided to try and salvage the trip, to convince ourselves it had all been in our heads. We made breakfast, went for a hike, did our best to act normal. But there was an undercurrent of tension. We all kept glancing over our shoulders, jumping at every snapping twig. As the day wore on, strange things started happening. Small at first, a water bottle missing here, a backpack in a different spot there. But then bigger things. Thomas's fancy camping knife vanished from right beside him while we were sitting around the fire. My entire bag of trail mix disappeared from inside my tent in the span of 2 minutes while I went to refill my water. We were all on edge, snapping at each other, paranoia growing by the hour. But none of us wanted to be the first to suggest leaving, to admit how terrified we really were. As the sun started to set, the dread became almost unbearable. None of us wanted to face another night out here. That's when Avery saw it first, that pale, elongated figure, standing motionless between 2 distant trees, watching us, grinning. We all saw it this time. It was like a spell broke. Without a word, we started grabbing our stuff, shoving things haphazardly into backpacks. "Leave it!" Thomas yelled as Avery tried to take down a tent. "Just grab what you can carry and let's go." We practically ran out of that clearing, not even bothering with flashlights, just desperate to get away. I glanced back once as we fled. It was still there, that nightmarish figure, and I swear to God, it waved at me. A slow, deliberate wave with fingers that seemed too long, too thin to be real. We hiked for hours in the dark, stumbling over roots and rocks, scratched by branches we couldn't see. No one suggested stopping. We just kept going until we finally reached the car, piling in and peeling out of there like our lives depended on it. The drive home was silent. What could we even say? How could we process what we'd seen? It's been months now, and I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, that grotesque grinning face haunting my dreams. I've tried to research, to find any explanation for what we encountered. Skinwalkers, Wendigos, aliens. Nothing quite fits. All I know is that there are things out there in the dark woods that defy explanation. Things that shouldn't exist, but do. And I'll never step foot in a forest again without remembering that pale face, those empty eyes, and that horrifying, knowing grin. It was supposed to be a fun getaway. Just me, my girlfriend Sarah, and our friends Mark and Emily. We were all feeling burnt out from work and wanted to disconnect from the world for a few days. Mark had heard about this remote lake deep in the national forest, completely off the grid with no cell service. It sounded perfect. We packed up Mark's SUV early Friday morning and hit the road, spirits high as we left the city behind. The drive took about 4 hours, the last hour on bumpy dirt roads winding through dense forest. When we finally reached the lake, I was blown away. The water was like glass, perfectly reflecting the surrounding pines. Not another soul in sight. We found a nice clearing near the shore to set up our tents. Mark and I gathered firewood while the girls got the camp organized. As the sun started to set, we cracked open some beers and grilled hot dogs over the fire, laughing and enjoying the peacefulness of nature. Everything was great that first night. We stayed up late stargazing. I'd never seen the Milky Way so clearly before. Eventually we turned in, Sarah and I in one tent, Mark and Emily in the other about 20 feet away. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up to Sarah shaking me. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I listened, still groggy. At first I didn't hear anything, but then I caught it, a rhythmic thumping sound coming from outside. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like it was moving around the campsite. Sarah clutched my arm tightly. "What is that?" she hissed. "Probably just a deer or something," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But something about the sound felt off, too regular, too deliberate for an animal. The thumping circled around to the far side of Mark and Emily's tent. Then I heard Mark's voice, muffled but clearly alarmed. "Hey, who's out there?" Suddenly there was a commotion, shouts of surprise, the sound of a tent unzipping, running footsteps. Sarah and I scrambled out of our tent. In the dim moonlight, I could see 2 figures dash into the woods, Mark and Emily. But why would they run off like that? "Mark, Emily?" I called out. No response. Sarah and I searched around the campsite with our flashlights, calling for our friends. Their tent was empty, sleeping bags still inside. We found no sign of a struggle, no clues to explain their sudden disappearance. We waited by the fire for hours, hoping they'd come back. As the sky began to lighten, we knew we had to do something. I suggested we drive to the ranger station we'd passed on the way in to report them missing. But when we tried to start the SUV, the engine wouldn't turn over. Panic started to set in then. We were miles from civilization with no phone signal, and our friends were missing. Sarah was on the verge of tears. I tried to stay calm and think logically. The ranger station was about 10 miles back the way we came. If we started walking now, we could make it there before dark. We packed some supplies and water and set off down the bumpy dirt road. Every snapping twig and rustle in the underbrush made us jump. I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. After what felt like an eternity of walking, we finally reached the ranger station. The head ranger, a gruff older man named Bill, listened to our story with a furrowed brow. He radioed for backup, and soon a search and rescue team was mobilized. Over the next few days, they scoured the area around the lake. Cadaver dogs, helicopters, the works. But they found nothing, No tracks, no scraps of clothing, nothing to indicate where Mark and Emily had gone. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. The police got involved, suspecting foul play. Sarah and I were interrogated for hours. They clearly thought we might have had something to do with our friend's disappearance, but eventually they had to admit there was no evidence of a crime. The case went cold. Mark and Emily's families were devastated. Sarah fell into a deep depression. I had trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares. We both started seeing a therapist to deal with the trauma. It's been 3 years now, and I still have no explanation for what happened that night. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just a bear or mountain lion that spooked Mark and Emily, causing them to flee into the woods and get lost. But deep down, I know that's not true. The rhythmic thumping, the way they vanished without a trace, it was something else, something unnatural. I've researched other strange disappearances in national forests. The number of cases is shocking. Some talk about interdimensional portals, others about cryptids or alien abductions. I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is that something horrifying happened at Blackwater Lake, something beyond normal explanation, and I'll never set foot in those woods again. It was supposed to be one last adventure before we all headed off to different colleges. Ryan, Jess, Matt, and I had been best friends since middle school, and we wanted to do something memorable before going our separate ways. That's when Ryan found this old map online, supposedly leading to a haunted area deep in the woods about an hour from our town. We all laughed it off as some stupid internet hoax, but the idea of a spooky camping trip sounded fun. We packed up Ryan's beat-up Jeep and hit the road early Saturday morning. The drive out was filled with our usual banter and bad singing along to the radio. As we got further from civilization, the paved roads gave way to gravel, then just rough dirt paths winding through increasingly dense forest. "You sure you know where we're going?" I asked Ryan as he squinted at his phone's GPS. "Relax, we're almost there," he assured me, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. After what felt like hours of bumping along barely there trails, we finally reached a small clearing that matched the description from the map. We piled out of the Jeep, stretching our legs and taking in our surroundings. The trees here seemed older, their gnarled branches reaching out like arthritic fingers. An unsettling quiet hung in the air. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just eerie stillness. As we set up our tents, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking at the edge of the clearing, but there was never anything there. As night fell, we built a campfire and broke out the beers and marshmallows. We were all a bit on edge, jumping at every snapping twig or flutter of wind through the leaves. But we tried to keep the mood light, telling ghost stories and cracking jokes. It was during a lull in conversation that I first heard it. A faint whisper carried on the breeze. I couldn't make out any words, just a soft susurration that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, looking around at my friends. They all shook their heads, giving me confused looks. I tried to laugh it off, blaming it on too many beers and an overactive imagination, but I couldn't quite convince myself. As the fire died down, we decided to turn in for the night. I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight as if that flimsy nylon could protect me from whatever was out there. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, unable to shake the feeling of unease. I must have eventually drifted off, because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake in a cold sweat. Something had woken me up, but I couldn't remember what. Then I heard it again, that same whisper, but closer now, right outside my tent. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I fumbled for my flashlight with trembling hands, afraid to even breathe. When I finally clicked it on, the beam cut through the darkness to reveal nothing. Just the side of my tent, gently swaying in the breeze. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling ridiculous, but as I went to turn off the flashlight, something caught my eye. A shadow, moving just beyond the tent wall. I froze, watching as it seemed to grow larger, looming over me. In a panic, I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent, stumbling out into the clearing. The full moon cast everything in an eerie, silvery glow. My eyes darted around, searching for whatever had cast that shadow, and then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure, tall and unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. But it was the face that made my blood run cold. Where there should have been eyes, there were only empty black sockets. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure just stood there, perfectly still, those hollow eyes boring into me. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone, vanished into thin air. I must have made some noise, because soon the others were stumbling out of their tents, asking what was wrong. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words got tangled in my throat. They clearly thought I was losing it, exchanging worried glances. "Maybe we should head back in the morning," Jess suggested gently. "I think we're all a little on edge out here." I nodded numbly, not trusting myself to speak. We all retreated back to our tents, but sleep was impossible now. Every rustle of leaves, every creaking branch had me on high alert. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, we silently packed up camp. No one wanted to admit it, but we were all eager to get out of there. We piled into the Jeep, Ryan gunning the engine before we'd even closed the doors. We'd barely made it a mile down the overgrown trail when Matt suddenly yelled, "Stop the car!" Ryan slammed on the brakes, sending us all lurching forward. "What? What is it?" he demanded. Matt was staring wide-eyed out the window. I thought I saw something. In the trees." We all peered out into the thick foliage, straining to see what had spooked Matt. And then I saw it too, that same impossibly tall, thin figure, standing motionless among the trees. Those empty eye sockets fixed on us. "Go, go, go!" I screamed, and Ryan didn't need to be told twice. He floored it, the Jeep bouncing wildly over the uneven ground. I kept my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, watching in horror as the figure seemed to glide between the trees, always staying just within sight. The whispers started again, growing louder and more insistent. It wasn't just me hearing them now. I could see the panic on my friends' faces as the sound filled the car. The words were still unintelligible, but the malevolence behind them was unmistakable. Ryan was pushing the Jeep to its limits, the engine whining in protest as we tore down the rough trail. Branches whipped against the windows, and more than once I was sure we were going to crash. But somehow, miraculously, we made it back to the main road. As we hit pavement, the whispers faded away. We all sat in stunned silence for a long moment, the only sound our ragged breathing and the rumble of the engine. Finally, Jess broke the silence. What the hell was that?" No one had an answer. We drove home in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. We tried to talk about it later, to make sense of what we'd experienced. But the words always fell short. How do you explain something like that? It's been months now, and I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, those empty eye sockets burned into my memory. I've tried to convince myself it was just a shared hallucination, some kind of mass hysteria brought on by fear and suggestion. But deep down, I know what I saw, what we all saw. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear those whispers again, carried on the wind. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in those woods is still out there, waiting, watching, ready to reach out from the shadows and pull us back into its world of darkness and terror. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully explain what happened to us that night, but I do know one thing for certain. I'm never setting foot in those woods again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. It was a Friday night, and my parents had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving me alone at our house. We live in this old farmhouse surrounded by dense woods. Usually I love how peaceful and secluded it is, but that night it felt oppressive and isolating. I was in my room watching Netflix, trying to distract myself from the eerie silence. Around 11 p.m., I heard what sounded like a woman's voice coming from outside. At first I thought I was imagining things, but then I heard it again. A faint, "Help me. Please help." My heart started racing. I paused my show and crept over to the window, peering out into the darkness. I couldn't see anything in the thick trees, just inky blackness. But the voice came again, louder this time. "Is anyone there? I need help." I was freaking out, debating what to do. It sounded like a woman in distress, but why would anyone be out in our woods at night? I thought about calling 911, but what if it was nothing and I looked like an idiot? After a few minutes of internal debate, I decided I should at least check it out. If someone really needed help, I'd feel awful ignoring them. With shaking hands, I grabbed a flashlight and my phone. I slipped on some shoes and crept downstairs, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it. At the back door, I hesitated. The voice called out again, sounding closer. "Please, I'm lost. Can anyone hear me?" Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped out onto the back porch. The air was cool and damp, and dead leaves crunched under my feet. I swept my flashlight beam across the tree line, calling out nervously, "Hello? Is someone there?" For a moment there was silence. Then I heard rustling in the underbrush, and a figure emerged from the trees about 50 feet away. My blood ran cold. It was a woman, or at least it looked vaguely like a woman. But something was horribly wrong. Her skin was a sickly grayish white, almost glowing in the darkness. Her hair hung in lank, wet-looking strands around her face, and her eyes, oh God, her eyes were just black, empty sockets. But the worst part was her mouth. She was smiling, but it wasn't a normal smile. It stretched unnaturally wide across her face, filled with pointed teeth. I stood frozen in terror as she took a step toward me, that awful grin never wavering. "Thank you for coming," she said in a raspy whisper. "I've been so lonely out here. Won't you join me?" Panic exploded through me and I scrambled backwards, nearly falling as I ran back inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it, then ran through the house, locking every door and window. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely manage the locks. I huddled in the living room, too scared to move. After a few minutes, I heard slow footsteps on the back porch. There was a gentle tapping on the window. "Please let me in," that horrible, raspy voice called. "I only want to be friends." I was sobbing at this point, fumbling for my phone to call 911. As I dialed, I heard more tapping, this time from the front of the house. She was circling the building, trying to find a way in. When the 911 operator answered, I babbled out what was happening between hysterical sobs. They said they were sending officers right away. I stayed on the line with them, describing the horrid apparition I'd seen, the tapping and calls to "Let me in" continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15-20 minutes. Then suddenly, everything went silent. A few minutes later, I heard sirens approaching. 2 officers arrived and did a thorough search of the property. They didn't find any sign of an intruder, and no footprints or disturbances in the woods. They were kind, but I could tell they thought I was just a hysterical teenager who'd scared herself with an overactive imagination. They offered to stay for a while to make me feel safe, but I was too embarrassed. I assured them I was fine now, and they finally left. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch with all the lights on, jumping at every little sound. When my parents got home the next day, I tried to tell them what happened. They exchanged worried looks and suggested maybe I'd had some kind of stress-induced hallucination. They even made me see a therapist, who said it was likely sleep paralysis or a vivid nightmare. But I know what I saw. That thing was real, whatever it was. Sometimes at night I still hear faint tapping at my window and a raspy voice calling for me to let her in. I don't know if she's really there or if it's all in my head now. Either way, I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe in this house again. Those haunting empty eyes and that twisted smile are burned into my memory forever. I'm writing this because I need to get it out, to tell someone who might believe me. Has anyone else encountered something like this? I feel like I'm losing my mind. That night changed me, and now I'm always looking over my shoulder, wondering if she's still out there in the woods, waiting. I was curled up on the couch, watching TV, trying to distract myself from the creepy noises of the old house creaking and groaning. Around 10 p.m., I heard a loud thump coming from the basement. My heart started racing immediately. I tried to tell myself it was just something falling over because of the wind, but then I heard it again and again. I sat there frozen, straining my ears. The thumping continued, along with what sounded like scratching, scraping. I couldn't quite place it, but it definitely wasn't normal house-settling noises. Part of me wanted to just ignore it and pretend I hadn't heard anything, but a bigger part of me knew I had to check it out, or I'd be up all night imagining the worst. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I crept towards the basement door, willing myself to be brave. The sounds got louder as I approached. My palms were sweating as I reached for the doorknob. I took a deep breath and yanked it open, shining my light down the stairs. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, just our dimly lit, cluttered basement. But then I noticed some of the boxes and junk had been moved around, creating a sort of makeshift fort in the corner. And poking out from under a ratty old blanket was a foot, a human foot. I let out a strangled gasp and almost dropped my phone. There was someone down there, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. My mind raced with possibilities, a burglar, a serial killer. I wanted to run, to call the police, but I was rooted to the spot in terror. Suddenly, the foot twitched and withdrew under the blanket. There was a rustling sound, and then a face emerged. It was a man, probably in his 30s, with wild matted hair and a scraggly beard. His eyes were huge and unfocused, darting around frantically. His skin was sallow and waxy, like he hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. For a moment, we just stared at each other in shock. Then his face contorted into a snarl, and he lunged at me with inhuman speed. I screamed and tried to slam the door, but he was already halfway up the stairs. His hand shot out and grabbed my ankle, yanking me off balance. I tumbled down the stairs, my head smacking against the steps. I was dazed, vision blurry as I felt myself being dragged across the cold concrete floor. The man was muttering incoherently, his breath hot and rancid on my face. I thrashed and kicked, trying desperately to get away, but he was unbelievably strong. He pinned me down, his hands wrapping around my throat. I clawed at his face, gasping for air. Black spots danced in front of my eyes as I felt consciousness slipping away. In that moment, I was sure I was going to die. I thought of my parents coming home to find my lifeless body in the basement. I thought of all the things I'd never get to do or experience. Just as I was about to pass out, there was a thunderous crash from upstairs. The man's grip loosened slightly as he cocked his head, listening. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps and shouting. The cavalry had arrived. The man panicked, releasing me and scrambling back to his makeshift nest. I gulped in huge lungfuls of air, coughing and spluttering. My vision cleared just in time to see two police officers tackling the intruder to the ground. He thrashed and howled like a wild animal as they struggled to handcuff him. Everything after that was a blur. Paramedics checked me over, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders as I shivered uncontrollably. More police arrived, along with my frantic parents who had been called by the neighbors. Apparently, they'd heard my screams and called 911. I learned later that the man was severely mentally ill and had escaped from a nearby psychiatric facility weeks earlier. He'd been living in our basement for days, sneaking out at night to steal food. The thought of him being down there while I slept, potentially watching me, made me physically ill. The physical bruises and cuts healed relatively quickly, but the mental and emotional scars ran much deeper. For months afterwards, I couldn't sleep without the lights on. Every little noise made me jump out of my skin. I had vivid nightmares of being choked, of dying alone in that dark basement. My parents tried to help, but they couldn't truly understand the terror I'd experienced. I started seeing a therapist, which helped somewhat, but I still felt on edge all the time, like danger was lurking around every corner. I withdrew from my friends, stopped participating in activities I used to love. The carefree, happy teenager I'd been was gone, replaced by a constantly anxious, paranoid shell of my former self. It took years of therapy and hard work to process the trauma of that night. Even now, over a decade later, I still get panicky in basements or dark, enclosed spaces. Thunderstorms make my heart race, and I'm always hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly on guard for potential threats. Sometimes I wonder how different my life would be if I hadn't gone to investigate those noises that night, if I'd just stayed upstairs and called the police right away. But then I remember that the man could have come up at any time. At least I was awake and somewhat prepared when it happened. I've come to accept that this experience will always be a part of me. It shaped who I am in many ways, some good, some bad. I'm more cautious now, but also more appreciative of life and safety. I have a deep empathy for others who've experienced trauma, and I never ever take my loved ones or my sense of security for granted. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that you never know what might be lurking in the shadows. Trust your instincts. Be aware of your surroundings. And don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it. You never know when an ordinary night at home might turn into a fight for survival. Around 11 p.m., I heard a strange noise coming from downstairs. At first I thought it was just the house settling, but then I heard what sounded like voices. My heart started racing. I tiptoed to the top of the stairs and peeked down. To my horror, I saw two men in dark clothes creeping through our living room. Panic gripped me. I ran back to my room as quietly as I could, desperately trying to figure out what to do. Should I call the police? Try to escape? I was paralyzed with fear. Then I heard footsteps coming up the stairs and knew I had to hide. I squeezed myself into my cramped bedroom closet, pushing aside hanging clothes to wedge myself into the corner. I could barely breathe as I heard the intruders enter my room. Through a tiny crack, I watched them rifling through my drawers and looking under the bed. "It's gotta be here somewhere," one of them muttered. "Keep looking," the other replied gruffly. "The boss said it would be in this house." My mind raced, trying to figure out what they could be searching for. We didn't have much of value, just some old jewelry and electronics. But these guys seemed to be after something specific. I held my breath as one of them approached the closet. He yanked the door open and I squeezed my eyes shut, certain I'd be discovered. But incredibly, he just pawed through the clothes hanging in front of me without noticing my small form, huddled in the corner. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes, I heard them moving on to my parents' room. I stayed frozen in place, terrified to make even the slightest sound. The house creaked and groaned as they tore it apart, looking for whatever mysterious item they sought. Eventually, I heard them go back downstairs. There was the sound of furniture being overturned and glass shattering. Then silence. Had they left? I was too scared to move or even open my eyes. I don't know how long I stayed crammed in that closet. My legs had gone numb and my back ached, but I didn't dare budge. Every tiny noise made me flinch. It wasn't until I heard my parents' voices that I finally emerged from my hiding spot. "Oh my God," my mom gasped as they took in the ransacked house. "Tommy? Tommy, where are you?" I stumbled out of my room on shaky legs. "I'm here," I called weakly. My parents rushed to me and wrapped me in a tight hug. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" my dad demanded, checking me over for injuries. I shook my head, still too stunned to speak. As the adrenaline faded, I started trembling uncontrollably. My mom held me close as my dad called the police. The next few hours were a blur of police questions and my parents fussing over me. Our house was a disaster. Furniture overturned, electronics missing, picture frames smashed. But all anyone cared about was that I was safe. It wasn't until days later that the full impact of what happened really hit me. I couldn't sleep without nightmares of shadowy figures creeping through the house. Every creak and groan startled me. I begged my parents not to leave me alone, even for a few minutes. They tried to reassure me that it was a random break-in, that lightning wouldn't strike twice. But I overheard them whispering about how the intruders seemed to be searching for something specific. What could have been in our ordinary suburban home that was worth ransacking the place? I became hyper-vigilant, always on edge. At school, I'd flinch at sudden noises or movements. My grades started slipping as I struggled to focus. My parents took me to a therapist, but talking about that night just made the memories more vivid. Even after we moved to a new house with a state-of-the-art security system, I never fully regained my sense of safety. To this day, I'm uncomfortable being alone in a house at night. Every unexplained sound sets my heart racing. The police never caught the intruders or figured out what they were after. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if maybe they were just ordinary burglars, and my frightened mind invented the mysterious boss and specific item they sought. But then I remember the cold certainty in their voices as they methodically tore apart my childhood home. I've tried to move on with my life, but that night left an indelible mark on me. The knowledge that strangers could violate the sanctity of your home, that nowhere is truly safe, is a heavy burden to carry. I'm grateful I wasn't harmed physically, but the psychological scars run deep. Sometimes I lie awake at night, straining to hear any out-of-place sounds. And a small part of me is always prepared to hide in the closet again, holding my breath and praying not to be found. Because you never know when the intruders might return, searching for that elusive something that apparently makes destroying a family's sense of security worthwhile. I've never shared this story publicly before. It feels both cathartic and terrifying to put it out there. I know logically that it's extremely unlikely anything like that would happen again, but logic doesn't always win out over deeply ingrained fear. To this day, I'm not sure what those men were really after or why they chose our house. Was it just random, or was there some connection we never uncovered? The not knowing is almost worse than the break-in itself. It leaves me with a lingering sense of unfinished business, like there's still a threat lurking out there somewhere. I try to live a normal life, but certain things still trigger that primal fear response. The sound of footsteps on stairs at night, a door creaking open unexpectedly. Sometimes I'll be in a crowded place and catch a glimpse of someone who reminds me of the intruders, sending my heart racing even though I know it's irrational. My family doesn't like to talk about that night. I think they feel guilty for leaving me alone, even though there's no way they could have predicted what would happen. My sister, born just hours after the break-in, has no memory of our old house or the fear that permeated it in the weeks after. Sometimes I envy her that innocence. I've tried various forms of therapy over the years: talk therapy, EMDR, exposure therapy. They've helped to some degree, but I don't think I'll ever be completely over it. It's just something I've had to learn to live with, like a chronic condition that flares up from time to time. There are still nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I hear intruders in the house. I have to do a full security check before I can calm down enough to sleep again. My partner is understanding, but I know it takes a toll on our relationship sometimes. I often wonder how different my life might have been if that night had never happened. Would I be less anxious, more trusting? Would I have pursued different career paths or relationships? It's impossible to know, but I can't help but feel that a fundamental part of who I am was shaped by those terrifying hours hiding in the closet. In a way, writing this out has been therapeutic. It's helped me process some of the lingering emotions and put the experience into perspective. But it's also stirred up memories and fears I thought I'd buried long ago. I hope that by sharing my story, maybe someone else who's been through something similar will feel less alone. And maybe it will serve as a reminder to cherish the feeling of safety when you have it, because you never know when it might be shattered. To this day, I still sometimes find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those shadowy figures from my past. But I'm trying to focus on moving forward, on building a life where fear doesn't control me. It's a daily struggle, but one I'm determined to win. Because in the end, I refuse to let those faceless intruders steal any more of my peace than they already have. I was in the living room watching TV and scrolling through my phone, just killing time until they got back. It was dark outside, probably around 9 p.m. I remember glancing up at the sliding glass door that led out to our back deck and freezing in absolute terror. There was a man sitting out there, just staring directly at me through the glass. My heart started pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I blinked a few times, hoping I was just seeing things, but he was still there. He looked to be in his 40s, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up. But what really got me was his face. He had this wide, creepy grin, and was silently laughing to himself as he watched me. I was completely paralyzed with fear for what felt like forever, just locked in this staring contest with this stranger on our deck. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I run? Should I confront him? Call for help? Before I could decide, he suddenly stood up and walked towards the door. That snapped me out of my daze, and I leapt into action. I ran to the door and fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so bad I could barely manage it. Just as I heard the click of it locking, the man reached the door and put his hand on the handle. I stumbled backwards, watching in horror as he tried to slide the door open. When it didn't budge, he just stood there, still grinning and staring at me with those wild eyes. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped in my own home with this psycho right outside. Finally, I managed to tear my eyes away and ran through the house, making sure every single door and window was locked. I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and dialed 911, praying they'd get here quickly. The whole time I kept glancing over my shoulder, terrified the man would find some way in. When I got back to the living room, heart in my throat, the man was gone. I searched every window, but there was no sign of him anywhere. Had I imagined the whole thing? No, it had felt way too real. The police arrived about 10 minutes later and searched the property thoroughly. They couldn't find any evidence that anyone had been there. No footprints, no fingerprints on the door, nothing. They took my statement, but I could tell they were skeptical. Hell, I was starting to doubt myself at that point. My parents got home not long after and were freaked out by what happened. We installed security cameras, and I wasn't allowed to be home alone for months after that. But honestly, I didn't want to be. Every little sound made me jump, convinced the man was back. It's been years now, but I've never fully gotten over that night. I still get an uneasy feeling when I'm home alone, like I'm being watched. Sometimes I swear I catch a glimpse of a hooded figure out of the corner of my eye, but when I look, there's nothing there. The rational part of my brain tells me it was probably just some drunk guy who wandered onto our property by mistake. Or maybe I dozed off watching TV and had an incredibly vivid nightmare. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. The pure malice in that man's eyes and his unsettling silent laughter. Those aren't things you can just imagine. I've tried therapy, meditation, even medication to shake this lingering fear, but nothing has fully worked. I'm always on edge, always feeling like I need to look over my shoulder. It's exhausting living like this, constantly on guard. The worst part is not knowing why. Why did he choose our house? Why didn't he try harder to get in? Was he just trying to scare me, or did he have worse intentions? And where did he go? How did he vanish without a trace? These questions haunt me to this day. I've spent countless hours scouring the internet for similar stories, hoping to find some explanation. But nothing quite matches what I experienced. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, watching and waiting. Maybe he's done this to other people too. The thought makes my skin crawl. I know it probably sounds crazy to still be so affected by something that happened years ago. But unless you've experienced that kind of fear, the feeling of being completely vulnerable and exposed in what should be your safe space, you can't understand how it changes you. I try to live a normal life, and most days I manage okay. But there's always that nagging feeling in the back of my mind, that sense that I'm not truly safe. I double and triple check the locks every night. I have night lights in every room. I avoid being home alone whenever possible. Sometimes I think about moving far away, starting fresh somewhere new. But then I realize it wouldn't matter. The fear would follow me anywhere I go. It's not about the house or the deck anymore. It's about the violation of safety. the shattering of that comforting illusion that bad things only happen to other people. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from that night. All I can do is try to move forward, one day at a time, but a part of me will always be that terrified teenager, locked in a staring contest with a grinning stranger on a dark night. If you're reading this and have ever experienced anything similar, please reach out. Knowing I'm not alone in this would bring some comfort. And if you haven't, cherish that feeling of safety in your home. You never know when it might be taken away. I still have nightmares about that night sometimes. In them, I'm frozen in place as the man slowly opens the door, that horrifying grin never leaving his face. I always wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, convinced he's in my room. It takes me hours to calm down enough to sleep again. One of the worst parts is how it's affected my relationships. I have a hard time trusting people now, always wondering if they have some hidden, sinister side. I've pushed away friends and potential partners because of my paranoia. It's lonely living like this, but I don't know how to let my guard down. I've tried explaining it to people, but unless they've been through something similar, they can't really understand. They tell me to just get over it, that it was years ago and nothing actually happened. But they don't get how traumatizing it is to have your sense of safety completely shattered like that. Sometimes I find myself obsessively checking the deck, especially at night. I'll stand at the glass door for hours, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. My parents worry about me, I know. They've suggested I move back home, but I'm determined to try and live independently, even if it terrifies me sometimes. I've developed all these little rituals and habits to try and feel safe. I always sit with my back to a wall so I can see all entrances. I keep a baseball bat by my bed. I have an elaborate system of checks I do before I can go to sleep each night. It's exhausting, but I can't seem to stop. There are good days where I almost feel normal again. But then something will trigger me, a hooded stranger on the street, an unexpected knock at the door, and I'm right back in that moment of paralyzing fear. I've tried to find some meaning in what happened, some reason why I was targeted. Was it random? Was I being stalked? Did the man know my parents would be out that night? The not knowing is almost worse than the incident itself. I've become hyper-vigilant about home security. I have cameras covering every angle of my property. I've reinforced all the doors and windows. I have multiple locks on everything. It probably seems excessive to most people, but it helps me sleep at night. Sometimes I wonder what I would do if I ever saw that man again. Would I confront him? Run away? Freeze up like before? I've played out countless scenarios in my head, but I honestly don't know how I'd react. I wish I could go back to that night and do things differently. Maybe if I had confronted him right away or called the police sooner, they would have caught him. Maybe I'd have answers now instead of this constant uncertainty. But I know dwelling on what-ifs doesn't help. All I can do is try to move forward and not let this experience define me completely. It's a daily struggle, but I'm determined to reclaim my life and my sense of safety. If you're reading this and relating to any of it, know that you're not alone. The fear may never completely go away, but it does get easier to manage with time. Find people you trust to talk to. Take whatever precautions help you feel safe, and don't let anyone dismiss your feelings. And please, always be aware of your surroundings. You never know when a normal night at home could turn into your worst nightmare. As I rounded a bend, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. I tensed, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Probably just an animal, I told myself. But then I heard it. A woman's scream, high and desperate, coming from somewhere in the woods. My heart started racing. Was someone in trouble? Should I stop and try to help? Everything in me was screaming to keep driving, to get the hell out of there. But what if someone really needed help? The screams came again, closer this time. "Help me! Please, help me!" The voice sounded terrified. Against my better judgment, I pulled over to the side of the road and got out of the car. The air was eerily still and silent now. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, hands shaking. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" For a long moment there was no response. Then I heard it again. "Help me!" But fainter now, as if moving deeper into the woods. I hesitated at the tree line, every instinct telling me not to go in there. But I couldn't just leave if someone was in danger. Taking a deep breath, I plunged into the forest. The trees closed in around me immediately, branches snagging at my clothes. My phone's light seemed pitiful against the oppressive darkness. I stumbled forward, straining my ears for any sound. "Where are you?" I shouted. "Keep calling out so I can find you." "Here, I'm over here." The voice was so faint I could barely make it out. I pushed on, tripping over roots and getting smacked in the face by low-hanging branches. After what felt like an eternity of stumbling through the pitch-black woods, I emerged into a small clearing. My light fell on a pale figure standing at the far edge. "Oh, thank God," I said, relief flooding through me. "Are you okay? What happened?" But as I moved closer, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. The figure was unnaturally still, and I couldn't make out any features, just a vague human shape. "Hello?" I said hesitantly. The figure's head snapped toward me with inhuman speed, and then it spoke, in a voice that was somehow both a whisper and a shriek. "Help me!" I stumbled backward in terror as the thing rushed at me. In the bobbing light of my phone, I caught glimpses of a woman's face, but wrong somehow, distorted and twisted. Long hair streamed behind it as it flew at me with impossible speed. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. Branches whipped at my face, but I barely felt them. All I could hear was my own ragged breathing and pounding heartbeat, and right behind me, that awful voice, "Help me, help me, help me, help me." I ran faster than I ever had in my life, driven by pure terror. But no matter how fast I went, that thing was right behind me. I could feel its cold breath on the back of my neck. Suddenly, my foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me. As I gasped for air, I felt icy fingers close around my ankle. "No!" I screamed, kicking frantically. My foot connected with something solid, and I heard an inhuman shriek of rage. I scrambled to my feet and took off again. I had no idea which direction I was going. All that mattered was getting away from that thing. Branches tore at my skin and clothes. My lungs were on fire. But I didn't dare slow down. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I burst out of the tree line and onto the road. My car was right there. I sprinted for it, fumbling for my keys. As I reached for the door handle, I made the mistake of looking back. There at the edge of the woods stood the woman, if you could call it that. In the harsh glare of my headlights, I could see her clearly for the first time. Her skin was a sickly gray-white, almost translucent. Dark veins stood out starkly beneath the surface. Her hair writhed around her head like living tendrils. But it was her eyes that would haunt me forever, pitch black and gleaming with malevolence. For a moment we just stared at each other. Then her mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. That awful scream poured out again. "Help me!" I dove into my car, slammed the door, and peeled out of there so fast I left tire marks on the road. I drove like a maniac, taking random turns, just trying to put as much distance between me and those woods as possible. It wasn't until the first rays of dawn started peeking over the horizon that I finally felt safe enough to pull over. I sat there shaking, trying to process what had happened. Had it all been some kind of hallucination? A vivid nightmare? But the scratches on my face and arms were all too real. And when I looked in the rearview mirror, my eyes were wild with lingering terror. I didn't tell anyone what happened that night. Who would believe me? I tried to convince myself it had all been some kind of stress-induced breakdown. But deep down, I knew the truth. A week later, I was scrolling through news headlines when one caught my eye. Woman's body found in forest, cause of death unknown. The location was right where I'd had my encounter. My blood ran cold as I read the article. The body had been discovered by hikers, partially decomposed. But the coroner's initial report noted some odd findings: gray, almost translucent skin, and strangely elongated teeth. I slammed my laptop shut, my hands shaking. What the hell had I encountered out there in those woods? And why did it want my help so badly? To this day, I can't drive down a dark road at night without breaking into a cold sweat. I avoid forests entirely. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed trying to sleep, I swear I can hear a faint whisper. Help me. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night. But I do know one thing. If you're ever driving down a lonely road and hear someone calling for help from the woods, just keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just get the hell out of there as fast as you can. Because whatever's out there waiting in the darkness, it's not human. And it doesn't want your help. It wants something far worse. It was around 11 p.m., and I was driving down a desolate stretch of back road, the kind where you don't see another car for miles. I was exhausted after a long day of sales calls, just wanting to make it to the next town to crash for the night. The darkness seemed to press in on all sides, broken only by my headlights cutting through the gloom. That's when I saw him, a young man, couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, standing on the shoulder with his thumb out. Now, I'm not usually one to pick up hitchhikers, especially at night. But something about this kid made me pull over. Maybe it was how lost and alone he looked out there in the middle of nowhere. I figured I'd at least offer him a ride to the next gas station or diner. As soon as he got in the car, I felt a chill run down my spine. His skin was deathly pale, almost translucent in the dim light. His eyes had a glassy, far-away look, but I chalked it up to him being cold and tired from being out there. "Thanks for stopping," he said in a quiet voice. "I've been out here for a while." "No problem," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Where you headed?" He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I'm not really sure anymore. Just away, I guess." We drove in silence for a few minutes. I kept sneaking glances at him out of the corner of my eye. There was something off about him that I couldn't quite put my finger on. His clothes looked outdated, like something from the 90s, and he had this stillness about him, barely seeming to breathe. I tried to make conversation to ease the growing tension. "So, what brings you out to the middle of nowhere at this hour?" He turned to look at me then, and I swear his eyes seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. "I died here," he said matter-of-factly. My blood ran cold. Surely I must have misheard him. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" "I died here," he repeated. "On this very road. It was a night just like this one." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. Every instinct was screaming at me to pull over and kick this guy out, but some morbid curiosity made me press on. "What do you mean you died here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He gazed out the windshield, his voice taking on a detached, dreamlike quality. It was so fast. One moment I was driving along, next thing I knew there were headlights coming straight at me. I tried to swerve, but it was too late. A chill ran through me as I realized we were approaching a sharp bend in the road, the exact kind of place where a head-on collision could easily happen. The young man continued, his voice growing more intense. The pain was indescribable, like every atom of my being was being ripped apart, and then darkness, an endless void. I wanted to tell him to stop, that I didn't want to hear anymore, but my mouth felt paralyzed with fear. But death wasn't the end, he went on. Something changed me, twisted me. Now I'm trapped here, reliving that moment over and over. His hand shot out suddenly, gripping my arm. His touch was ice cold. "Do you know what it's like?" he asked, his voice rising. "To die again and again, never able to move on?" I jerked away from his grasp, nearly swerving off the road. "Look, I don't know what kind of sick joke this is, but I want you out of my car. Now." He didn't seem to hear me. His eyes had taken on a wild, frenzied look. "I can't escape it. The darkness always finds me. It's coming for me again. Can't you feel it?" And in that moment I did feel something, a creeping dread that seemed to seep into my very bones. The air in the car grew thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. The darkness outside pressed in closer, as if trying to swallow us whole. "Please," I begged, "just stop. This isn't funny anymore." He turned to me then, and his face, God, his face. It was like a mask of death, skin gray and sagging, eyes sunken and lifeless. When he spoke again, his voice was a low, inhuman growl. "You can't outrun death. It comes for us all in the end." I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching as the car fishtailed on the empty road. Without thinking, I threw open my door and tumbled out onto the pavement. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. It wasn't until I had put a good distance between myself and the car that I finally stopped, gasping for breath. When I turned around, the road behind me was empty. No sign of my car or the ghostly hitchhiker. I stood there for what felt like hours, shaking and trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, I worked up the courage to walk back to where I'd left my car. To my shock, it was right where I'd stopped, engine still running. The passenger seat was empty, no sign that anyone had ever been there. I got back in and drove to the nearest town in a daze, checking into a motel for the night. Sleep was impossible. I kept replaying the encounter over and over, trying to convince myself it had all been some kind of hallucination brought on by fatigue. But I know what I saw, what I felt. That young man, or whatever he was real. And the terror of that night will stay with me forever. I don't know if I'll ever be able to drive that stretch of road again. Hell, I'm not sure I can bring myself to do any more long nighttime drives. The darkness feels different now, alive somehow, waiting. I can't shake the feeling that death was in my car that night, and that it let me go, for now. It was supposed to be a simple overnight haul, taking a load of supplies up to a remote ski lodge. I've done similar runs dozens of times before without incident. The weather was clear as I set out just after sunset, my trusty old Peterbilt rumbling along the winding mountain highway. About 3 hours in, I was deep in the wilderness, nothing around but dense forest and sheer cliffs. The road was practically deserted at that hour. I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. That's when my truck started acting up. At first it was just a slight shuddering, barely noticeable, but within minutes the engine was sputtering and losing power. I managed to pull over onto a narrow shoulder just before it died completely. "Damn it," I muttered, climbing down from the cab. This was the last thing I needed in such a remote area, especially at night. I popped the hood and started checking the usual suspects: belts, hoses, spark plugs, but everything looked fine at first glance. I was about to radio for assistance when movement caught my eye further up the road. A figure was walking toward me out of the darkness. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it must be another driver stopping to help. But as the person got closer, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a long dark coat despite the warm night, but it was his face that made my skin crawl. His features were gaunt, almost skeletal, with sunken eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the gloom. His mouth was fixed in a rictus grin that never wavered. "Need some help there, friend?" he called out in a raspy voice that set my nerves on edge. I forced myself to stay calm. No thanks. Just a minor issue. I've got it under control." The stranger kept walking closer. "Oh, I insist. I know all about trucks like yours. Let me take a look." Every instinct screamed at me to get back in the cab and lock the doors. But before I could move, the man was suddenly right next to me. I hadn't even seen him cover the last 20 feet. Up close, his appearance was even more unsettling. His skin had an odd grayish pallor and seemed almost translucent. Those glowing eyes bored into me with an intensity that made me want to run screaming into the woods. "I can help you," he said, reaching toward me with long, bony fingers. "Just let me in." I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. "Stay back," I yelled. "I don't need any help." In a panic, I scrambled into the cab and slammed the door, fumbling to lock it. The strange man pressed his face against the window, that horrifying grin never faltering. "Let me in," he rasped. "I only want to help you." I turned the key, praying the engine would start. To my immense relief, it roared to life. I threw it in gear and floored the accelerator, tires squealing as I pulled away. In the rearview mirror, I saw the man standing in the middle of the road, perfectly still, watching me drive off. Then he simply vanished into thin air. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever the hell that thing was. After a few minutes, my racing heart began to slow. I told myself I must have imagined it, that the stress and fatigue were playing tricks on my mind. But then I saw him again. He was standing on the shoulder about a half-mile ahead, that same sinister grin plastered on his face. It was impossible. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. Yet there he was, clear as day in my headlights. I swerved into the opposite lane to avoid him, horn blaring. As I passed, he turned to watch me, raising one hand as if in greeting. Then he was gone again. This cycle repeated over and over for the next hour. Every few miles, the man would appear on the roadside. Sometimes he'd be standing still, other times walking along as if waiting for me. Once I even saw him perched on top of a road sign, crouched like some monstrous bird. Each time, that leering grin and those glowing eyes were fixed on me, and each time he'd vanish the moment I passed by. I was in full-blown panic mode now, radio chattering uselessly as I tried to call for help. My hands were slick with sweat on the wheel as I pushed the old truck to its limits, taking the winding turns way too fast. At one point, I came around a sharp bend and saw him standing directly in the middle of my lane. I slammed on the brakes, the truck's tires screaming as I fought to keep control. Just before impact, the figure dissolved into mist. Breathing heavily, I sat there for a moment trying to collect myself. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of mental breakdown or hallucination. But it felt so real, so viscerally terrifying. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually I forced myself to keep driving. I had to get to civilization, to other people. Maybe then this nightmare would end. The encounters grew more frequent and more aggressive as I neared the outskirts of the small mountain town that was my destination. The man appeared every few hundred yards now, sometimes lunging at the truck or running alongside it. His rasping voice seemed to echo inside my head. "Let me in. I can help you. Just let me in." I was openly weeping now, my nerves completely shot. In desperation, I laid on the horn and flashed my lights, hoping to wake up anyone in the scattered homes I was now passing. Finally, blessedly, I saw the lights of the town ahead. As I crossed the city limits, a wave of relief washed over me. Surely whatever madness was happening would end now that I was around other people. I screeched to a halt in front of the first open business I saw, an all-night diner. Shaking and sobbing, I stumbled out of the cab and ran inside. The handful of patrons and staff looked alarmed as I burst in, wild-eyed and babbling about the man who'd been chasing me. They must have thought I was drunk or on drugs. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion hit me like a freight train. I collapsed into a booth, gratefully accepting the coffee someone pressed into my hands. It took a while, but I eventually calmed down enough to give a somewhat coherent account of what had happened. The locals exchanged worried glances as I spoke. When I finished, there was a long silence. Finally, an older man at the counter spoke up. "You're not the first to see him," he said quietly. "That stretch of road, there's something not right about it, especially at night." He went on to tell me about other travelers who'd reported similar encounters over the years. A nightmarish figure appearing out of nowhere, always with that leering grin, always trying to get people to let him in or accept his help. "Consider yourself lucky," the man said. "Not everyone who sees him makes it to town." I spent the rest of the night in that diner, too terrified to go back out to my truck. When dawn finally broke, I steeled myself to finish my delivery and get the hell out of those mountains. As I drove through town in the early morning light, movement caught my eye. For a heart-stopping moment, I saw that familiar figure standing on a street corner, watching me pass. But when I looked again, it was just an ordinary man waiting for a bus. I've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Stress, fatigue, my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. Something inhuman stalks that lonely mountain road, and I thank God I made it out alive. I don't know if I'll ever drive a truck again, let alone take another nighttime run through the mountains. The memory of that grinning face and those glowing eyes still haunts my dreams. All I know is that I'll never forget that terrifying night, and the close encounter with something that defies explanation. We'd been driving for hours already and were both tired, but knew we only had about 30 more minutes to go. The road was winding through dense forest, trees pressing in close on both sides. I was focused on the road ahead, trying not to let my exhaustion get the better of me. Suddenly, Natalie gasped and grabbed my arm. "Oh my God, did you see that?" she whispered urgently. I glanced over at her. "See what?" "There was someone standing by the side of the road back there," she said, her voice shaky. "Just standing there in the dark." A chill ran down my spine. "Are you sure? It was probably just a tree or something." But even as I said it, I felt uneasy. This road was seriously isolated, We hadn't passed another car in over an hour. What would someone be doing out here in the middle of nowhere at this time of night? I tried to brush it off, telling Natalie it was probably nothing. But I could see her peering nervously out the window, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A few minutes later, I saw it too. As we rounded a bend, the headlights briefly illuminated a figure standing motionless on the shoulder. It was unmistakably a person, tall and thin, wearing a dark hooded coat. Before I could get a better look, we'd already passed by. My heart was pounding now. "Okay, that was definitely someone," I said. "But it's probably just some local weirdo or something. Nothing to worry about." Natalie didn't seem convinced. "I don't like this," she said. "Can we please just get to the farm as fast as possible?" I nodded and pressed down on the accelerator, pushing us a bit over the speed limit. The faster we got out of here, the better. But things only got creepier from there. As we continued down the road, I kept catching glimpses of movement in the trees. Shadows flitting between trunks, branches swaying when there was no wind. And the sounds, God, the sounds. At first it was just occasional rustling or snapping twigs. But then we started hearing what sounded like footsteps, keeping pace with our car just out of sight in the woods. Natalie was full-on freaking out at this point, and I wasn't far behind. I had both hands clenched on the steering wheel, knuckles white, constantly checking the rearview mirror. "It's following us," Natalie whimpered. "How is it keeping up with the car?" I didn't have an answer. None of this made any sense. I was going almost 60 mph at this point, way too fast for these twisty back roads. But I was too scared to slow down. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night, echoing through the trees. Natalie shrieked, and I nearly drove off the road in shock. "What the fuck was that?" I yelled. I don't know." Natalie was sobbing now. "Please, just get us out of here." I floored it, the engine roaring as I pushed the car to its limits. The screaming continued, sometimes sounding like it was right next to us, other times fading into the distance, only to suddenly get loud again. It didn't sound human, more like some kind of animal, but unlike anything I'd ever heard before. We tore down that road like bats out of hell, the world outside reduced to a dark blur. I was terrified we'd crash, but even more scared of whatever was out there. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes or so, we finally saw lights up ahead. Never in my life have I been so relieved to see civilization. As we got closer, I recognized the entrance to Natalie's family's farm. I screeched to a stop in front of the farmhouse, gravel spraying. We both scrambled out of the car and ran for the front door, not even bothering to grab our bags. Natalie's parents came rushing out, alarmed by our panicked arrival. "What's wrong? What happened?" her mom asked as we burst inside. We tried to explain, tripping over our words as we described the hooded figure and the sounds in the forest. But even as we spoke, I realized how crazy it all sounded. Natalie's parents exchanged concerned looks. "Are you sure you didn't just spook yourselves?" her dad asked gently. "It's awful dark out there on that road. Your eyes can play tricks on you." I wanted to argue, to make them understand the terror we'd just experienced. But doubt was already creeping in. Had we imagined it all? Let our tired minds conjure up bogeymen in the shadows? We spent a mostly sleepless night, jumping at every little sound. The next morning, Natalie's dad drove back down the road with us to retrieve our luggage from the car. In the light of day, everything seemed so normal. No sign of anything strange in the woods. But as we neared the spot where we'd first seen the figure, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, just off the shoulder, was a single footprint in the mud. A large, bare human foot. I didn't say anything. I couldn't bear to freak Natalie out again, or try to convince her skeptical parents. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, late at night, I still hear those screams echoing in my dreams. We never did find out what really happened that night. Was it some kind of elaborate prank, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, or something far more sinister? All I know is that I'll never forget that drive or shake the feeling that something was out there in those woods, something that defied explanation and still gives me chills to this day. Natalie and I don't talk about it much anymore. It's easier to try and pretend it never happened, but we both know the truth, that for one terrifying night we glimpsed something beyond our understanding, and I pray we never encounter anything like it again. Around 9 p.m., I got up to grab a snack from the kitchen. As I was walking back to the living room, movement outside the window caught my eye. I froze, peering out into the darkness. At first I didn't see anything besides the rain coming down in sheets, but then a flash of lightning illuminated the street, and I saw him. There was a man standing on the sidewalk across from my house, completely motionless. He was wearing a long, dark coat with the hood pulled up, obscuring most of his face. But I could see that he was staring directly at my window, directly at me. A chill ran down my spine. Who the hell stands out in the middle of a storm like that? I blinked, hoping it was just my imagination. But when another lightning strike lit up the night, he was still there, still staring. I quickly backed away from the window, my heart pounding. It was probably just some weirdo, I told myself. Nothing to freak out about. I tried to go back to my game, but I couldn't focus. Every few minutes I'd glance nervously at the window, half expecting to see that hooded figure pressed up against the glass. After about 20 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to check if he was still out there. I crept back to the window and peeked out. The street was empty. I let out a shaky breath, feeling silly for getting so worked up. See? Nothing to worry about. He must have just been some guy waiting for a ride or something. I had just settled back on the couch when I heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on my front door. I jumped, my controller clattering to the floor. It was probably just a neighbor, right? Maybe someone's power went out and they needed help. But deep down, I knew. I knew who it was. The knocking came again, louder this time. I sat frozen, hardly daring to breathe. Maybe if I stayed quiet, he'd think no one was home and go away. No such luck. The knocking continued, growing more insistent. It was like he knew I was in here, knew I was ignoring him. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear as the pounding on my door echoed through the house. It felt like hours. Eventually, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I strained my ears, trying to hear if he was still out there, but all I could hear was the storm and my own ragged breathing. After what felt like an eternity, I finally worked up the courage to approach the door. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the deadbolt. I opened the door just a crack and peered out. The porch was empty, but there, weighed down by a rock, was a small piece of paper. With trembling fingers I reached out and grabbed it. Written in messy scrawl were 3 words that made my blood run cold. Do you remember? I slammed the door shut and locked it, my mind racing. What the hell did that mean? Remember what? I'd never seen that hooded man before in my life. This had to be some sick prank, right? I spent the next hour pacing around my house, jumping at every little noise. I checked and rechecked that all the doors and windows were locked. I even grabbed a kitchen knife, though I had no idea what I'd do with it if that man actually got inside. Around midnight, my phone rang, making me nearly jump out of my skin. The caller ID showed an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Hello, I stammered. There was just silence on the other end, then a raspy whisper. Do you remember? I hung up and threw the phone across the room like it had burned me. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare. I pinched myself hard, praying I'd wake up, but I didn't. This was real. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat huddled on my bed, knife clutched to my chest, staring wide-eyed at the bedroom door until dawn. As soon as it was light out, I called in sick to work and drove straight to my parents' house an hour away. I needed to be around other people, to feel safe. I spent the next week there, jumping at every shadow and hardly sleeping. My parents were worried sick, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what had happened. They'd think I was crazy. Eventually, I had to go back home. I couldn't hide forever. But things seemed different when I returned. The oppressive feeling of being watched was gone. Maybe it really had just been an elaborate prank, and the prankster had gotten bored and moved on. I started to relax, to feel normal again, until last night. I woke up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom. As I was stumbling back to bed in the dark, I heard it, a whisper, right next to my ear. Do you remember? I whirled around, but there was no one there. The house was empty. I was alone. But I know what I heard. He was here, in my house. And I still have no idea what he wants me to remember. I haven't slept since then. I'm writing this now from a 24-hour diner, too terrified to go back home. I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm losing my mind. What does he want from me? Why me? And most importantly, what am I supposed to remember? I'm scared that one of these nights I'm going to wake up and he'll be standing over my bed. And this time, he won't just ask if I remember. He'll make sure I never forget. If anyone has experienced anything similar or has any idea what this could mean, please help. I'm desperate. I can't live like this anymore, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every noise. I need answers. And to the hooded man, if you're somehow reading this, please, just tell me what you want. What am I supposed to remember? I'll do anything. Just leave me alone. I don't know how much longer I can take this. The lack of sleep, the constant fear, it's wearing me down. Sometimes I think I see him out of the corner of my eye, but when I turn to look, there's nothing there. Am I going crazy? Is this all in my head? But then I remember that note, the phone call, the whisper in the dark. Those were real. This is real. I'm considering moving, changing my number, doing whatever it takes to get away from this. But deep down, I have a feeling it won't matter. He'll find me. He'll always find me. Because whatever it is I'm supposed to remember, whatever I've forgotten, it's important enough for him to go to these lengths. And I have a sinking feeling that until I remember, he'll never stop. So here I sit, in this brightly lit diner at 4 a.m, jumping every time the bell over the door chimes, watching, waiting, wondering if the next person to walk in will be wearing a dark hood. And all the while, that question echoes in my mind, driving me to the brink of madness. Do you remember? I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. Ghost stories, urban legends, all that stuff. I always thought it was just nonsense people made up for attention. But after what happened last summer, I'm not so sure anymore. I can't explain it, and part of me still doesn't want to believe it, but I know what I saw, what we saw. It was a muggy July evening, one of those sticky summer nights where the air feels thick and heavy. A big storm was rolling in, dark clouds building on the horizon. My 6-year-old son Arthur was bouncing off the walls with excitement. He's always loved watching thunderstorms. As the first rumbles of thunder echoed in the distance, I suggested we head out to the gazebo in the backyard to watch the storm roll in. Arthur raced ahead of me, his bare feet slapping against the wooden planks of the gazebo floor. I followed at a more leisurely pace, settling into one of the Adirondack chairs as Arthur pressed his face against the railing. The wind was starting to pick up, whipping through the trees at the edge of our property. Sheet lightning illuminated the sky, followed by a booming crack of thunder that made Arthur jump and giggle. "Look, Daddy, the trees are dancing," he shouted, pointing at the swaying branches. I smiled, enjoying his childlike wonder at the power of nature. But as another flash of lightning lit up the yard, I noticed something that made my smile fade. There was a figure standing at the tree line, partially obscured by the shadows. At first I thought it must be a neighbor, maybe checking on their property before the storm hit. But something about the way it was standing there, perfectly still, sent a chill down my spine. "Arthur, come sit with me for a minute," I called, trying to keep my voice calm. He bounded over and climbed into my lap as I peered into the gathering darkness, straining to make out details of the figure. It was definitely human-shaped, but unnaturally tall and thin, and it seemed to be watching us. I blinked hard, sure I must be imagining things. When I looked again, it was gone. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, my eyes playing tricks on me in the storm. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. We stayed out in the gazebo for another 20 minutes or so as the storm intensified. I kept glancing nervously at the tree line, but saw no further sign of the figure. Eventually the rain started coming down in sheets and we retreated inside. I got Arthur dried off and into his pajamas, then tucked him into bed. He fell asleep quickly, worn out from the excitement of the storm. I stayed up for a while longer, puttering around the house and trying to convince myself that I hadn't really seen anything out there. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by Arthur's terrified scream. I leapt out of bed and raced to his room, finding him huddled under the covers, shaking. "Daddy, Daddy, he's outside my window," he sobbed as I gathered him into my arms. "Shh, it's okay, buddy. It was just a bad dream," I soothed, rubbing his back. But a part of me went cold at his words. "No, I saw him. The tall man from the trees. He was looking in at me." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Keeping my voice steady, I asked Arthur to stay in my room while I checked things out. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen and cautiously approached Arthur's bedroom window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a thick blanket of fog. I peered out into the misty darkness, seeing nothing at first. Then a flicker of movement caught my eye. My breath caught in my throat as I made out a towering, impossibly thin silhouette standing motionless about 20 feet from the house. My hand shaking, I fumbled to turn on the flashlight. The beam cut through the fog, illuminating nothing. The figure had vanished. Heart pounding, I quickly checked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked tight. I even stepped out onto the back porch, scanning the yard and calling out. But there was no sign of anyone. When I went back upstairs, Arthur was curled up in my bed, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you see him, Daddy?" he whispered. I hesitated, torn between reassuring him and validating what we'd both experienced. I'm not sure, buddy, but don't worry. I checked everywhere and made sure we're safe." Try to get some sleep, okay?" He nodded and snuggled close as I climbed into bed. Neither of us slept much that night. The next morning I scoured the yard for any sign of an intruder, footprints, broken branches, anything. But the ground was soft from the rain, and I couldn't find a single track that didn't belong to Arthur or me. I called the police to report a possible prowler, but without any evidence there wasn't much they could do. The officer who came by did a cursory check of the property and advised me to install some security cameras. Over the next few weeks, I found myself jumping at every shadow, constantly checking the windows and scanning the tree line. Arthur refused to sleep in his own room, plagued by nightmares of the tall man. I tried to convince myself it had all been some kind of shared hallucination brought on by the storm and the darkness. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. We never spotted the figure again after that night. But sometimes, when I'm out in the yard at dusk, I get the prickling sensation of eyes on me. And on stormy nights, I find myself avoiding looking out the windows, afraid of what I might see looking back. I don't know what that thing was or why it was watching us. Part of me hopes I never find out. But another part of me can't help wondering, is it still out there, waiting? And will it come back someday? I know this all sounds crazy. If someone had told me this story a year ago, I would have laughed it off. But I can't deny what Arthur and I experienced. It's changed the way I see the world. There are things out there we can't explain, things that defy logic and reason, and sometimes they come right up to our windows and peer in at us in the night. So the next time you're watching a storm roll in or taking out the trash after dark, just remember, you might not be as alone as you think, and not everything watching from the shadows is human. Recently moved into this old house on the outskirts of town. It was a great deal, spacious, lots of character, and way cheaper than anything else I'd looked at. Sure, it needed some work, but I figured I could fix it up over time. Little did I know what I was really getting myself into. The first few days were pretty normal as I settled in and started unpacking. But on the fourth night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was around 2 a.m., and I was half asleep when I heard what sounded like a child's laughter coming from somewhere below my bedroom. At first I thought I must be dreaming, but then I heard it again, a high-pitched giggle that seemed to be rising up through the floorboards. My heart racing, I got up and turned on all the lights, checking every room. But the house was empty and silent. I tried to convince myself it was just old pipes or the house settling, but deep down I knew it was something else. Something wasn't right about this place. The next day, I decided to do a thorough inspection of the whole house, including the basement. The realtor had mentioned there was an unfinished basement, but I hadn't bothered to check it out yet. As I made my way down the creaky wooden stairs, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air got noticeably colder and damper with each step. The basement was dark and musty, filled with cobwebs and decades of dust. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I noticed something odd about one of the walls. There was a faint outline, almost like a doorway, that didn't quite match the rest of the brickwork. Heart pounding, I ran my fingers along the edge and felt a slight draft. There was definitely something behind this wall. I spent the next hour carefully prying at the bricks until finally, with a grinding sound, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a hidden passageway. The opening was small. I had to crouch down to fit through. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn back, but my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the darkness. The passage was narrow and damp, twisting downward for what felt like forever. Just when I thought it would never end, It opened up into a small, circular room, and that's when I saw her. Sitting in an old wooden chair in the center of the room was a little girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old. She was deathly pale, wearing a tattered dress that looked like it was from another century. But the most unnerving thing was her eyes. They were pitch black and seemed to stare right through me. I stood there frozen, unable to move or speak. The girl's head slowly turned towards me, her gaze locking onto mine. In a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well, she spoke. "Why did you leave me?" A wave of terror washed over me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The girl's face began to contort, her mouth opening wider and wider until it was an impossibly large black void. That awful voice came again, louder this time. "Why did you leave me?" I don't know how, but I managed to break free from whatever force was holding me in place. I turned and ran, scrambling back up the passage as fast as I could. I could hear her voice echoing behind me, getting closer and closer. "Why did you leave me? Why did you leave me?" I burst out of the hidden doorway, slamming it shut behind me. I ran up the basement stairs, out of the house, and didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove straight to a motel and checked in, unable to face going back to that house. I kept seeing that little girl's face, hearing her voice in my head. Who was she? What happened to her? And why did she think I had left her? I spent a sleepless night at the motel, jumping at every little sound. The next morning I called the realtor and told her I was terminating the lease immediately. I didn't care about losing my deposit. She seemed confused and kept asking what was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. How could I describe what I'd seen? Who would believe me? It's been a week now, and I still can't shake the feeling of dread that comes over me when I think about that house. I wake up in a cold sweat every night, that little girl's voice echoing in my dreams. I've tried researching the history of the house, looking for any clues about who she might have been, but I've found nothing concrete. Part of me wants to go back, to try and find out more, but a bigger part of me is terrified of what might happen if I do. What if she's still there, waiting? What if next time I can't escape? I don't know if I'll ever understand what really happened in that basement. All I know is that I'll never set foot in that house again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. The road was pitch black, except for my headlights cutting through the darkness. There were no street lights out here in the rural back roads, just endless fields and forests on either side. I was gripping the steering wheel tightly, leaning forward and squinting to try and make out the road ahead. Suddenly, a bright flash of lightning lit up the sky and road in front of me. For a split second, everything was illuminated in stark white light. And that's when I saw him. There was a man standing in the middle of the road, directly in my path. He was dressed all in white, white suit, white shoes, even a white hat. In that brief moment of illumination, I could see his face clearly. He was older, probably in his 60s, with a gaunt face and sunken eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching on the wet pavement as I swerved to avoid hitting him. My heart was racing as I brought the car to a stop, breathing heavily. I looked in my rearview mirror, expecting to see the man I'd nearly hit, but there was no one there. The road behind me was completely empty. I sat there for a few moments, trying to calm my nerves and make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Maybe it was just a trick of the light, my tired mind playing tricks on me. I took a few deep breaths and decided to continue on. I was only about 20 minutes from home at this point. As I started driving again, I couldn't shake the image of that man from my mind. His ghostly pale face, those piercing eyes. It had seemed so real. I turned up the radio, hoping the music would distract me. A few minutes later, another flash of lightning lit up the night. And there he was again. The man in white, standing on the side of the road this time. I caught just a glimpse of him as I drove past, but it was unmistakably the same man. My blood ran cold. This couldn't be happening. I sped up, pushing my old Honda to go faster than was probably safe on these wet roads. I just wanted to get home as quickly as possible. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. The next time the lightning flashed, I was afraid to look, but I couldn't help it. My eyes were drawn to the side of the road, and sure enough, there he was again. This time he was facing away from the road, just standing there in the pouring rain. I let out an involuntary yelp of fear. This was impossible. How could this man be appearing over and over, miles apart? Was I losing my mind? I was going way too fast now, the car hydroplaning slightly on the wet road. But I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from whatever was happening. Suddenly, a deer darted out in front of me. I swerved instinctively to avoid it, but I was going too fast. I lost control of the car. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion as the car spun out, leaving the road and rolling down a small embankment. I must have blacked out for a few moments. When I came to, the car was on its side in a ditch. Rain was pouring in through the broken driver's side window. I was dazed and disoriented, but seemingly not seriously hurt. As I unbuckled my seatbelt and tried to orient myself, I became aware of a figure standing just outside the car. My blood turned to ice as I realized it was him, the man in white. He was peering in at me through the broken window, rain dripping from the brim of his white hat. Those sunken eyes bored into me. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come out. He reached a pale hand towards me. I scrambled backwards across the seats, desperate to get away from him, but there was nowhere for me to go. Just as his fingers were about to touch me, there was a blinding flash of light. I squeezed my eyes shut. When I opened them again, he was gone. I sat there shaking for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Eventually, I heard sirens in the distance. Someone must have seen my headlights in the ditch and called for help. When the police and paramedics arrived, I was barely coherent. They assumed I was in shock from the accident. I couldn't bring myself to tell them about the man in white. They'd think I was crazy. As they loaded me into the ambulance, one of the officers was talking to his partner. I overheard snippets of their conversation. Yeah, this stretch of road is notorious for accidents, especially in bad weather. I've heard all the stories. Supposedly some guy went missing out here like 50 years ago. His car was found abandoned, but they never found him. Oh yeah, I remember my grandpa telling me about that when I was a kid. Freaked me out. Said the guy was all dressed in white, right? I felt the blood drain from my face. It couldn't be. Later at the hospital, after I'd been treated for minor injuries, I worked up the courage to ask one of the nurses about it. She seemed hesitant to talk about it at first, but eventually told me the story. Apparently, back in the 1960s, there was a wealthy businessman who lived in the area. He was known for always dressing in white suits. One stormy night, he went out for a drive and never came home. His car was found on that stretch of road, but there was no sign of him. Some people thought he'd been murdered. Others said he'd run off to start a new life. But he was never found. Ever since then, there have been stories of people seeing a man in white appear on that road during storms. Most wrote it off as an urban legend, but hearing the nurse tell it and knowing what I'd seen sent chills down my spine. I was discharged from the hospital the next day. My car was totaled, so my sister came to pick me up. As we drove home, it started to rain again. I found myself obsessively scanning the sides of the road, my heart racing every time lightning flashed. It's been months now, but I still can't shake the memory of that night. I avoid driving at night whenever possible, especially if there's even a chance of rain. When I do have to drive in storms, I white-knuckle the steering wheel the whole time, terrified I'll see that ghostly figure appear again. I don't know what that spirit wants, or why it appeared to me that night. Was it trying to warn me, or something more sinister? I'll probably never know. But I do know that I'll never forget the night I encountered the man in white, and how close I came to joining him in whatever limbo he's trapped in. Sometimes late at night, when I hear thunder rumbling in the distance, I swear I can see a faint white figure at the edge of my vision, but I'm too afraid to look directly at it. Some things are better left unseen. My family had just moved into this old wooden house surrounded by dense forests. At first, everything seemed normal. Unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, exploring our new surroundings. But looking back, there were little signs from the very beginning that something wasn't quite right. The first thing I noticed was how Rusty, our golden retriever, started acting weird as soon as we arrived. He'd always been such a happy, friendly dog, but suddenly he became jumpy and agitated. He'd bark at empty corners of rooms or growl at nothing. At night, I'd hear him pacing restlessly and whining. I tried to ignore it at first. New place, new smells. I figured Rusty just needed time to adjust. But deep down, his behavior unsettled me. Animals can sense things we can't, right? A few days after we moved in, I met our neighbor Nolan for the first time. I was out in the yard with Rusty when this gaunt, pale man emerged from the trees. Something about him immediately made my skin crawl. His eyes looked wrong somehow, empty, and he had this unnerving, twisted smile that never quite reached those dead eyes. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said in a raspy voice. Rusty started growling and backing away. I wanted to run inside, but I was frozen in place. Nolan just stood there, staring at me with that eerie grin. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and vanished back into the woods without another word. I ran inside and told my parents, but they brushed it off. Just an odd neighbor, they said. Nothing to worry about. But things only got weirder from there. Objects would move on their own when no one was looking. Doors would slam shut for no reason. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, only to find it empty. My parents tried to rationalize it all away. Old house settling, drafts, overactive imagination. But I knew something was seriously wrong. I could feel eyes on me constantly, like I was being watched from every shadow. The incident that really terrified me happened about 2 weeks after we moved in. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, that familiar feeling of being watched stronger than ever. I looked towards my window, and my blood ran cold. There was Nolan, pressed right up against the glass, staring in at me with those horrible empty eyes. His face was contorted into an inhuman grimace, mouth stretched impossibly wide to reveal rows of sharp teeth. I screamed, and my parents came running. But by the time they got there, Nolan was gone without a trace. That was the last straw for my family. We packed up and left the very next day, abandoning most of our stuff in our hurry to get away from that house. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. In the years since, I've never been able to shake the feeling that something followed us from that place. I still wake up some nights in a cold sweat, certain I've just seen Nolan's face leering at me from the darkness. I hear whispers and footsteps when I'm alone. Objects still move when I'm not looking. I've tried therapy, medication, everything I can think of, but nothing helps. That summer in Louisiana broke something in my reality, and I don't think it can ever be fixed. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows. Those empty eyes and that twisted smile are burned into my memory forever. I don't know what exactly happened in that house or what Nolan really was. All I know is that ever since then, I've never felt truly safe or alone. Whatever was in that house, whatever Nolan was, I think a piece of it latched onto me somehow, and I don't know if I'll ever be free of it. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if it was just some kind of prolonged hallucination brought on by the stress of moving, but then I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, or wake up to find things in my room rearranged, and I know it was real. All of it was real. I've never gone back to that house, never even looked it up online to see if it's still there. I'm too afraid of what I might find. Are other families living there now, experiencing the same terror we did? Or is it abandoned, a dark presence waiting for new victims? Part of me wants to investigate, to try and find some explanation for what happened. But a bigger part is paralyzed with fear at the thought of stirring up those memories again. What if looking into it somehow makes things worse? What if it draws that thing's attention back to me even more strongly? So I stay quiet, try to live a normal life. But the fear is always there, lurking just below the surface. Every unexpected noise makes me jump. Every shadow seems to hide malevolent eyes. I can never truly relax, never feel at peace. I'm sharing this now in hopes that maybe someone out there has experienced something similar, that maybe I'm not alone in this waking nightmare, or maybe writing it all down will help exorcise these demons somehow. I don't know. All I know is that one summer when I was 12 years old, I encountered something in rural Louisiana that defied explanation, something that has haunted me ever since. And no matter how far I run or how much time passes, I don't think I'll ever truly escape it. If you're reading this and you've had similar experiences, please reach out. And if you haven't, count yourself lucky. There are things in this world that we aren't meant to understand, forces beyond our comprehension. I learned that the hard way, and it's a lesson I'll never forget. I still have nightmares about that house, about Nolan's face in my window. I wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, certain that if I open my eyes, I'll see those empty sockets staring back at me. The rational part of my brain says it's just trauma, just bad memories. But another part, a deeper instinct, knows better, knows that the terror is still out there, waiting. Some nights I lie awake for hours, every creak and groan of the house setting me on edge. I strain my ears, certain I can hear whispered voices just on the edge of hearing. Sometimes I swear I catch a whiff of the musty, rotten smell that permeated that old Louisiana house. I've tried moving, tried changing my name, tried everything I can think of to leave it all behind. But it always finds me, always. I'll start to feel safe, start to think maybe it's finally over. Then I'll come home to find my furniture subtly rearranged, or wake up with strange scratches on my skin. The worst part is the not knowing what exactly happened, what Nolan was, why we were targeted. Was it just random chance that brought us to that house? Or were we chosen somehow? And why me? Why do I still feel its effects so strongly when the rest of my family seems to have moved on? I've thought about reaching out to the current owners of the house, warning them somehow. But what would I even say? Hey, I lived in your house 15 years ago, and I think it's haunted by an evil entity that may or may not look like a creepy neighbor named Nolan. They'd think I was insane. So I stay silent, carrying this burden alone, always watching, always waiting for the other shoe to drop, because deep down, I know this isn't over. Whatever latched onto me in that house is patient. It can wait. And someday, when I least expect it, I know I'll turn around and see Nolan's twisted face grinning at me one last time. If you're reading this, please, be careful. There are dark things in this world, things that defy explanation. And once they notice you, once they get their hooks in you, they never truly let go. I learned that lesson in a lonely house in rural Louisiana, and it's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to believe in ghosts or the paranormal. But after what happened in our new house, I'm not so sure anymore. It all started when my husband Jake and I bought this beautiful old Victorian home from the 1920s. We were so excited to start our life together and hopefully start a family soon. The house needed some work, but we saw so much potential in it. On moving day, we were unpacking boxes and exploring all the nooks and crannies of our new home. That's when I noticed something odd in the hallway upstairs. There was this slight bulge in the wallpaper that just didn't look right. When I ran my hand over it, I felt the outline of what seemed to be a door frame underneath. "Jake, come look at this," I called out. He came upstairs and I showed him what I'd found. We were both intrigued and decided to peel back the wallpaper. Sure enough, there was an old wooden door that had been completely papered over, as if someone was trying to hide its existence. We looked at each other with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. What could be behind this hidden door? Part of me wanted to leave it alone. After all, if someone went through the trouble of concealing it, maybe it was for a good reason. But curiosity got the better of us. Jake went to grab some tools, and we carefully pried the door open. It creaked loudly as it swung inward, revealing a small room that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. A thick layer of dust covered everything. There was some old furniture, a desk, a chair, some bookshelves. But what struck me most was the oppressive feeling as soon as we stepped inside. The air felt heavy and cold. I immediately got goosebumps all over my body. "This is so weird," I whispered. "Why would anyone seal off this room?" Jake shrugged. "No idea, but hey, bonus room, right? We can fix it up." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. We explored a bit more, but there wasn't much to see, just some old books and papers, nothing too interesting. We decided to air it out and deal with it later. We still had a ton of unpacking to do. That night was when things started to get strange. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. At first I thought it was Jake, but he was sound asleep next to me. The steps were slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth. My heart started racing. I shook Jake awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered urgently. He listened for a moment, then nodded. "What the hell?" We both got up to investigate, but as soon as we opened our bedroom door, the sound stopped. The hallway was empty and silent. We checked the whole house but found nothing out of place. "Maybe it was just the house settling," Jake suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. We went back to bed, but I barely slept the rest of the night. The next day we threw ourselves into unpacking and settling in, trying to ignore what had happened. But that night, I woke up again to more unexplained noises. This time it sounded like someone was in that hidden room, moving furniture around. I nudged Jake. "There it is again." We crept to the door of the hidden room. The sounds were definitely coming from inside. Jake slowly turned the handle and pushed the door open. The noises immediately stopped. The room was exactly as we'd left it, dusty and untouched. This pattern continued for the next few nights. Strange sounds, shadows moving in the corner of my eye, the constant feeling of being watched. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. Jake was skeptical at first, but even he couldn't deny the weird occurrences. Things came to a head about a week after we moved in. I had gotten up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. As I was washing my hands, I glanced up at the mirror and my blood ran cold. There was a dark figure standing behind me, just a vague human shape, but definitely there. I spun around, but there was nothing. When I looked back at the mirror, it was gone. I ran back to our room in a panic, slamming the door behind me. Jake bolted upright in bed. "What's wrong?" he asked, alarmed. I was shaking as I told him what I'd seen. He held me as I cried, unsure what to think, but trying to comfort me. "Maybe we should look into the history of this house," he suggested. "There has to be an explanation for all this." The next day, we went to the local library to do some research. What we found chilled me to the bone. Apparently, back in the 1930s, a man had murdered his entire family in this house before killing himself. The records were vague, but it seemed the killings had taken place in that hidden room. We also discovered that every family who had lived in the house since then had moved out within a year, complaining of paranormal activity. The last owners had apparently brought in some kind of spiritual expert who advised them to seal off the room to contain the negative energy. I wanted to move out immediately, but Jake was hesitant. We'd put all our savings into this house. We decided to try cleansing the house first. We burned sage, said prayers, even brought in a local medium. Nothing seemed to help. The activity escalated. Objects would move on their own. We'd hear disembodied voices whispering. The dark figure I'd seen in the mirror started appearing more frequently, always just out of the corner of our eyes or reflected in windows. It all came to a head one night, about a month after we'd moved in. We were lying in bed, both too scared to sleep, when we heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. Our bedroom door slowly creaked open. I'll never forget the terror of that moment. A black, shadowy figure stood in our doorway. It was like looking at a person-shaped hole in reality. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Jake's hand found mine and squeezed tight. The figure took a step into our room. That's when something in me snapped. All the fear and stress of the past month came boiling to the surface. "No!" I shouted, sitting up in bed. "This is our home now. You don't belong here anymore. Leave us alone." To my utter shock, the figure stopped. It stood there for a long moment, then slowly nodded its head, and then, like smoke dissipating, it faded away. Jake and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Eventually he spoke. Is it over?" I nodded slowly. "I think so. I think it's finally over." And it was. From that night on, all paranormal activity in the house ceased. No more noises, no more shadows, no more feeling of being watched. It was like a heavy weight had been lifted. We still live in that house today. We've made it our own, filled it with love and laughter. We even turned that hidden room into a beautiful nursery for our daughter. Sometimes I think about that night, about the shadowy figure. I still don't fully understand what happened or why, but I do know that we faced our fears and reclaimed our home. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to believe in ghosts. But after everything we experienced, I know there are things in this world that can't be easily explained. All I know is that our home is at peace now, and so are we. From the moment I moved in, something felt off. At first, I chalked it up to just being in a new place and all the stress of moving. But as the days went on, I started noticing weird little things. Objects would be in different spots than where I left them. I'd hear creaking floorboards at night when I was the only one home. The house just had this heavy, oppressive feeling sometimes. The basement especially gave me the creeps. There was this old wooden rocking chair down there that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. For some reason, that chair really unsettled me. I tried moving it upstairs to use it, but every time I came home, it would somehow be back in the basement again. I thought I was losing my mind. After about a week of this, I decided to do some research on the house's history. That's when I learned about Eleanor Martin, the elderly woman who had lived here for over 50 years before passing away. She had been a widow for most of that time, living alone in this big old house. The more I read about her, the sadder I felt. It must have been so lonely for her. One night, I was having trouble sleeping and went downstairs for a glass of water. As I passed the open basement door, I froze. There, clear as day, was the ghostly figure of an old woman sitting in that rocking chair. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I wanted to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. The ghost, Eleanor, I assumed, just sat there, slowly rocking back and forth. She didn't seem angry or menacing. If anything, she looked sad and lost. In that moment, my fear turned to pity. This had been her home for so long. Of course she wouldn't want to leave. Gathering all my courage, I spoke to her. "Eleanor," I said softly, "I know this was your home for a long time. I'm sorry if I've disturbed you. I don't want to make you leave. Maybe we can both live here." The ghost stopped rocking and turned to look at me. I swear I saw a faint smile cross her translucent face. Then she faded away, leaving the chair empty once more. The next day, I moved the rocking chair up to the living room and placed it by the front window. It seemed right, somehow. And you know what? It stayed there. No more mysteriously ending up back in the basement. It's been a few months now, and I've gotten used to sharing my home with Eleanor. Sometimes at night, I'll hear the gentle creak of the rocking chair. It used to freak me out, but now I find it oddly comforting. I imagine her sitting there, looking out at the neighborhood she loved for so many years. I've learned to coexist with my spectral housemate. I'll talk to her sometimes, telling her about my day or asking her opinion on home improvement projects. I don't know if she can really hear me, but it feels right. The weirdest part is how normal it all seems now. I never believed in ghosts before, but living with one has become my new reality. Eleanor doesn't cause any trouble. She just wants to stay in the home she loved. And honestly, I'm glad for the company. I've started leaving little offerings for her, fresh flowers by the rocking chair, or her favorite tea. I found out what it was from old grocery lists in a drawer. It's my way of showing respect and appreciation for letting me share her space. There was one night, about a month ago, that really cemented our unusual living arrangement. I had a terrible day at work and came home in a foul mood. As I sulked on the couch, I suddenly felt a cool breeze and the oddest sensation, like someone was gently patting my shoulder. I looked over, and for just a second, I saw Eleanor's ghostly form next to me, a look of grandmotherly concern on her face. Then she was gone, but I felt so much better. I know this all sounds crazy. If someone had told me this story a year ago, I would have thought they were nuts. But living through it has changed my whole perspective on life, death, and what might exist beyond our understanding. I'm not scared of Eleanor anymore. If anything, I'm grateful for her presence. This house doesn't feel lonely or oppressive now. It feels like a home with history and character. I'm just the latest chapter in its long story. Sometimes I wonder what will happen when it's my time to move on. Will I join Eleanor, watching over this house we both loved? Or will I finally be able to help her find peace and move on herself? I guess only time will tell. For now, I'm content with our unusual roommate situation. If you ever come to visit, don't be alarmed if you hear the rocking chair creaking on its own. That's just Eleanor, keeping watch over her beloved home. And who knows, maybe she'll decide she likes you enough to let you catch a glimpse of her too. I never thought I'd say this, but living in a haunted house isn't so bad after all. It's taught me a lot about compassion, understanding, and the enduring power of human connection, even when one of those humans is no longer among the living. So if you ever move into an old house and start experiencing strange occurrences, don't be too quick to run away. You might just find yourself with an unexpected friendship that transcends the boundaries between this world and the next. Just remember to always be respectful, keep an open mind, and maybe invest in a good rocking chair. You never know who might appreciate it. I was 26 when I finally saved up enough for a down payment on a small 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood. It needed some work, but I was thrilled to have a place to call my own. The day I moved in, I was filled with optimism as I carried boxes inside and started unpacking. That night, as I was settling into sleep, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from above. At first I dismissed it as old pipes or the house settling, but it kept getting louder and more insistent. It sounded like something was dragging across the floor of the attic. I tried to ignore it and go to sleep, but the noise was driving me crazy. Around 2 a.m., I finally got up to investigate. The access to the attic was through a trap door in the hallway ceiling. I pulled down the ladder and climbed up, shining my phone flashlight into the darkness. The attic was mostly empty except for some old furniture covered in sheets. As I swept my light around, I noticed a door on the far wall that I hadn't seen before. It looked much older than the rest of the house. The scratching sound was definitely coming from behind it. My heart was pounding as I approached the door. Part of me wanted to run back downstairs and forget about it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I reached out and turned the rusty doorknob. The door creaked open to reveal a small hidden room, no bigger than a walk-in closet. There was an old iron bed frame with a stained mattress, a chair, and not much else. But what made my blood run cold was the woman sitting on the bed. She was deathly pale and gaunt, with matted gray hair hanging in her face. Her nightgown was dirty and torn. When she looked up at me, her eyes were completely black. I stumbled backwards in shock, nearly falling down the attic ladder. The woman lunged at me with inhuman speed, her bony fingers grasping at my shirt. I managed to slam the door shut just as she reached it. I raced downstairs in a panic, grabbed my car keys, and drove to the police station. I must have sounded like a raving lunatic as I told them about the ghost woman in my attic. They seemed skeptical, but agreed to send an officer to check it out. When we got back to the house, I led them up to the attic. But when I opened the hidden door, the room was completely empty. No bed, no woman, nothing. The officer looked at me like I was crazy and suggested I might be under too much stress from the move. I couldn't believe it. I knew what I had seen. That woman had been real, or at least as real as a ghost could be. But with no evidence, there was nothing the police could do. That night, I tried to convince myself it had all been a vivid hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But as I lay in bed, I heard the scratching start up again. This time, It was accompanied by a woman's voice, softly calling my name. I buried my head under the pillow, but I could still hear her. The scratching got more frantic, like she was trying to claw her way through the ceiling. Then I heard footsteps in the attic, slow and dragging. I was paralyzed with fear as the footsteps made their way to the attic hatch. There was a long pause. Then the hatch slowly started to open. I bolted out of bed and ran outside in my pajamas, not even bothering to grab my keys or phone. I spent the rest of the night in my car, too terrified to go back inside. The next day, I called a real estate agent and put the house up for sale immediately. I hired movers to pack up my stuff because I couldn't bear to step foot in there again. I crashed on a friend's couch until I could find a new place. It's been 5 years, and I still have nightmares about that woman in the attic. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear scratching above me. I've tried therapy and medication, but nothing seems to fully erase the trauma of that night. Part of me wonders if she's still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting owner to find her. I've thought about trying to warn potential buyers, but I know they'd never believe me. Who would believe a story about a ghost in the attic? I've done research trying to find any history of deaths or strange occurrences in that house, but I've come up empty. There's no record of a woman dying there or any other paranormal activity. It's like she never existed. Sometimes I question if it really happened or if I imagined the whole thing. But then I'll catch a glimpse of a pale face in a window reflection or hear a faint scratching sound, and the terror comes flooding back. I know I'll never be able to fully explain or understand what I experienced in that house. All I know is that I'll never forget the sight of that woman's black eyes staring into mine, or the sound of her voice calling my name in the dark. I still drive by the house sometimes, usually late at night when I can't sleep. I'll sit in my car across the street, staring up at the attic window. Part of me hopes to see some sign of her, just to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. But the house always looks dark and still. I wonder about the family living there now. Do they hear the scratching at night? Have they found the hidden room? Or is the woman only revealing herself to me? I've thought about reaching out to them, but I know how it would sound. Hey, I used to live in your house and there's a ghost in your attic. They'd think I was insane, so I keep my secret and I live with the fear. I double-check every closet before I go to sleep. I avoid attics at all costs, and I never ever buy old houses anymore. I know it sounds crazy. I know most people would never believe me. But I'm sharing my story in the hopes that maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. Maybe I'm not alone in this nightmare. If you're reading this and you've seen her too, please reach out. I need to know I'm not going insane. And if you're thinking of buying an old house, check the attic thoroughly. You never know what might be hiding behind a hidden door. I still don't know who that woman was or why she was there. Was she a ghost? A demon? Some kind of interdimensional being? All I know is that she was real, and she was terrifying. Sometimes I wonder if I should have tried to help her somehow. Maybe she was trapped and needed someone to set her free. But then I remember the malice in her eyes, the way she lunged at me with those claw-like hands, and I know I made the right choice in running. I've tried to move on with my life, but the memory of that night haunts me. I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, I'll see her again. And next time, I might not be able to escape. So I live in constant vigilance, always looking over my shoulder, always listening for that telltale scratching sound. Because I know now that there are things in this world that can't be explained, things that lurk in the shadows and wait for unsuspecting victims. If you're reading this, be careful. Check your attics, investigate strange noises, and trust your instincts. because you never know when you might stumble upon something that will change your life forever, something that will make you question everything you thought you knew about reality. As for me, I'll keep searching for answers, keep trying to understand what happened that night. But deep down, I know I'll probably never find the truth. All I can do is share my story and hope that it helps someone else avoid the terror I experienced. So if you hear scratching in your attic tonight, think twice before you investigate. Some doors are better left unopened, some secrets better left buried. Because once you've seen what's on the other side, you can never go back to the person you were before. I was just a small-town cop. Never imagined I'd encounter something that would shake me to my core. It all started on a crisp autumn morning when I got the call about a missing kid. Tommy, 8 years old, vanished from his own backyard. His mom was hysterical on the phone, babbling about how he was there 1 minute and gone the next. When I arrived at their house, the fear in his mother's eyes hit me like a punch to the gut. She was clutching Tommy's favorite stuffed animal, tears streaming down her face. "Please find my baby," she begged. I promised I'd do everything in my power to bring him home safe. We started searching the neighborhood, knocking on doors, checking every nook and cranny where a kid might hide. But as the hours ticked by with no sign of Tommy, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. This wasn't some game of hide-and-seek gone too far. By afternoon, we'd expanded the search to the dense woods bordering the neighborhood. I'd grown up exploring those trees, but now they seemed menacing, shadows stretching long in the fading daylight. The search party fanned out, calling Tommy's name until our voices grew hoarse. That's when I spotted it, a tiny sneaker half buried in the leaves. My heart nearly stopped. It was Tommy's all right. His mom had described the Spider-Man design. But there was only one shoe, no tracks, nothing else to indicate which way he'd gone. I radioed it in, and soon the area was crawling with forensics teams and search dogs. But something kept nagging at me, drawing me deeper into the woods. It was like a whisper on the wind, barely there, but insistent. Against my better judgment, I followed it. The further I went, the darker it got, trees pressing in close. My flashlight beam seemed swallowed by the gloom. That whisper grew louder, resolving into what sounded like a child's voice. "Tommy?" I called out, hope and dread warring in my chest. No answer, but the voice kept going, leading me on. I stumbled through brambles, my uniform catching on branches, but I couldn't stop. I had to find that kid. Suddenly, I broke into a small clearing, and there he was. Tommy, standing stock still in the center, his back to me. Relief flooded through me. "Tommy, thank God we've been looking everywhere for you, buddy." He didn't respond, didn't even twitch. As I got closer, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was off. "Tommy?" I said again, softer this time. He turned, slow and jerky like a puppet on strings, and I saw his face. It was Tommy, but wrong. His skin was waxy pale, eyes dark pits that seemed to go on forever. No light reflected in them, no spark of life. My breath caught in my throat as he stared at me, head cocked at an unnatural angle. "Want to play?" The voice that came out of Tommy's mouth wasn't his. It was old, rasping, gleeful in a way that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back, fumbling for my radio, my gun, anything. But Tommy, or whatever was wearing Tommy's face, just smiled wider. His teeth looked sharp in the dim light. "Come on, officer. Don't you want to find the boy?" Before I could react, he darted into the trees, inhumanly fast. I gave chase, heart pounding. The forest seemed to shift around me, paths appearing and disappearing. Tommy's laughter echoed from every direction. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs burned, legs trembling with exhaustion. Finally, I burst into another clearing and skidded to a halt. A massive, writhing shadow loomed before me. It was vaguely human-shaped, but kept shifting, tendrils of darkness reaching out. And there, in the middle of it all, was Tommy. The real Tommy this time, eyes wide with terror. "Help me!" he cried, reaching toward me as the shadow began to engulf him. I lunged forward, grabbing for his outstretched hand. For a moment, our fingers touched. Then the shadow surged, and Tommy was gone. The clearing plunged into darkness. I spun wildly, trying to get my bearings. My flashlight flickered weakly, barely penetrating the gloom. And then I heard it. That raspy, ancient voice right by my ear. "Thanks for playing, officer. We'll be seeing you again soon." A cold wind whipped past me, and suddenly I was alone. The forest was quiet, no sign of Tommy or the shadow creature. I staggered back the way I'd come, my mind reeling. When I finally stumbled out of the woods, I was met by the worried faces of the search party. They'd been looking for me for hours, they said. I'd been missing almost as long as Tommy. I tried to explain what happened, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I describe the impossible things I'd seen? They'd think I was crazy. Hell, maybe I was crazy. In the end, the search for Tommy was called off after a week. No trace of him was ever found, except for that one shoe in the woods. His mother was devastated, the whole town shaken. But I know the truth. Something is out there in those woods, something ancient and hungry. It took Tommy, and I'm afraid it's not done yet. Every night I dream of those empty eyes, that shifting shadow, and I wonder, when will it come for me? I can't shake the feeling that this is just the beginning. That thing in the woods is patient, and it's waiting for its next victim, its next game. And God help us all when it decides to play again. I've requested a transfer to another precinct, far from here. But deep down, I know it won't matter. Whatever I encountered in those woods that day has marked me somehow. I can feel its eyes on me, even now. To anyone reading this, be careful. The world is bigger and darker than we know. There are things out there beyond our understanding, and sometimes they decide to reach out and touch our lives in the most horrifying ways. I don't know if I'll ever see Tommy again, or if I'll be the next to disappear. All I know is that I'll never look at the woods the same way, and neither should you. Stay safe out there, folks, and whatever you do, don't go into the forest alone. As I pulled up to the house, everything seemed normal at first glance. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow over a well-manicured lawn. But as I approached the front door, I could sense the tension in the air. The door opened before I could even knock, revealing a woman in her mid-30s with wide, frightened eyes. "Thank God you're here," she said, her voice trembling. I think there's someone in my house." I asked her to step outside while I investigated, my hand resting on my holstered weapon. She explained that she'd been hearing strange noises coming from under her bed for the past hour, scratching sounds and what sounded like labored breathing. At first, she'd tried to convince herself it was just the house settling or her imagination running wild. But then she heard a distinct thump, like something hitting the underside of the bed frame. My training kicked in as I entered the house, moving cautiously from room to room. Everything seemed undisturbed until I reached the master bedroom. The bed was neatly made, but I could see slight movement of the comforter, as if something underneath was shifting ever so slightly. Heart pounding, I crouched down and lifted the edge of the comforter. What I saw in that moment is seared into my memory forever. There, wedged into the narrow space between the floor and bed frame, was a man. but he was unlike any person I'd ever encountered. He was rail-thin, almost skeletal, with sallow skin stretched taut over prominent bones. His clothes were tattered and filthy, like he'd been living rough for months, but it was his eyes that truly chilled me to the core, wide and unblinking, with a feverish, manic gleam that spoke of a mind unhinged. For a moment, we just stared at each other in shocked silence. Then I found my voice and ordered him to come out slowly, with his hands visible. He didn't move at first, just kept staring with those unsettling eyes. I repeated the command more forcefully, reaching for my cuffs. That's when everything went to hell. With a speed I wouldn't have thought possible given his emaciated state, the man lunged at me. His bony fingers clawed at my face as he shrieked inhumanly. I stumbled backwards, my training momentarily forgotten in the face of this feral assault. We grappled for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. His strength was shocking, fueled by some crazed desperation. I managed to throw him off, scrambling to my feet as he bolted for the bedroom door. I gave chase, but he moved with an unnatural quickness. By the time I made it outside, he had vanished into the night without a trace. The woman was still on the front lawn, and she screamed when she saw my battered appearance. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity, backup arriving, taking statements, searching the area. But we found nothing. It was like the intruder had simply evaporated into thin air. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this incident than a simple break-in gone wrong. The man's appearance, his impossible strength and speed, the way he'd vanished so completely, none of it added up. I started asking around, talking to some of the older cops on the force. Most of them brushed off my concerns, chalking it up to an adrenaline-fueled misperception of events. But there was one, a grizzled veteran nearing retirement, who took me aside after shift one night. "Listen, kid," he said in a low voice, glancing around to make sure we were alone. "There are things out there that don't fit neatly into police reports, things that defy explanation. I've seen a few in my time on the job, and they have a way of leaving their mark on you." He wouldn't elaborate further, just patted me on the shoulder with a knowing look and walked away. But his words stuck with me, feeding the gnawing sense of unease that had taken root since that night. I threw myself into the investigation, poring over missing persons reports and criminal records, trying to find any lead on the mysterious intruder. But every avenue I pursued led to a dead end. It was like the man had never existed outside of that terrifying encounter. Weeks turned to months, and gradually the incident faded from the forefront of my mind, but I never fully shook the memory of those wild, desperate eyes staring up at me from beneath the bed. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, feeling phantom fingers clawing at my face. To this day, I can't explain what really happened that night. Was it just a desperate homeless man, driven to extremes by hunger and mental illness? Or was it something else entirely, something beyond the realm of ordinary human experience? I don't have answers, only lingering questions and a persistent feeling that I brushed up against something profound and inexplicable. It's changed the way I view the world, made me acutely aware of the thin veil between the familiar and the unknown. Every time I respond to a call now, there's a part of me that wonders if I'll encounter something that defies explanation. Will I once again find myself face to face with the impossible, forced to confront the limits of my understanding? I've never shared the full story before now. It sounds too fantastical, too much like the ramblings of someone who's lost touch with reality. But I know what I saw, what I experienced, and I can't shake the feeling that there are things out there in the darkness, things that occasionally reveal themselves to unsuspecting people like me, leaving us forever changed. So I keep my eyes open, stay vigilant, because now I know that the mundane can give way to the extraordinary in the blink of an eye. And when it does, all you can do is hold on and hope you make it through to the other side with your sanity intact. That night under the bed was just the beginning. I don't know if I'll ever encounter anything like it again, but I do know that I'll never look at the world quite the same way. There are depths to reality that most people never glimpse, and once you've seen them, you can never truly go back. I was working the afternoon shift that fall day, just like any other. The leaves were starting to change color, painting the trees in vibrant reds and golds. It was a beautiful time of year in our small town, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach as I drove my patrol car down the winding forest roads. Earlier that day, we'd gotten a call from a hiker about a strange old man wandering in the woods. Normally, I wouldn't think much of it. Plenty of elderly folks like to take walks in nature. But something in the hiker's voice set me on edge. He said the old man seemed off somehow, moving in an unnatural way. I tried to push the thoughts aside as I scanned the trees lining the road. It was probably nothing, just an overactive imagination. Still, I found myself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. As I rounded a bend, movement caught my eye. There, just off the shoulder of the road, was a figure emerging from the tree line. My heart skipped a beat. It was an old man, matching the hiker's description. I pulled over and got out of the car, calling out a friendly greeting. But as the man turned to face me, the words died in my throat. His skin was pale and waxy, stretched tight over a skeletal frame, but it was his eyes that truly chilled me to the bone. They were empty, devoid of any spark of life or humanity, just flat, glassy orbs staring right through me. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked if he needed any help. The old man didn't respond. He just stood there, swaying slightly, head cocked to the side as if listening to something I couldn't hear. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, and I shivered. The temperature seemed to have dropped several degrees in the last few minutes. I opened my mouth to speak again, but before I could get a word out, the old man's head snapped towards the forest. In an instant, he was gone. One moment he was standing right in front of me. The next, he had vanished into the trees. I blinked in confusion, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. It wasn't possible for someone, especially an elderly man, to move that fast. I hesitated for a moment, then made my way to the edge of the woods, where he'd disappeared. "Sir," I called out, peering into the shadows between the trees. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" Silence. The forest seemed unnaturally still. No birds chirping, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just a heavy, oppressive quiet that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I took a few cautious steps into the woods, dried leaves crunching under my feet. The canopy of branches overhead cast everything in deep shadow. I strained my eyes, trying to catch any hint of movement. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound coming from somewhere behind me. I whirled around, hand instinctively going to my holster. But there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. The sound came again, closer this time. A deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through my whole body. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I stumbled backwards, nearly tripping over a root. The growl intensified, and with it came a sense of presence, like something massive and ancient was bearing down on me, just out of sight. Panic seized me. All thoughts of finding the old man vanished, replaced by a primal need to get away. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I sprinted blindly through the woods. The presence followed, always just behind me. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck, hear the thundering of its footsteps. But every time I looked back, there was nothing there, just empty air and swaying trees. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. My lungs were burning, legs trembling with exhaustion. But the sheer terror coursing through my veins kept me going. Finally, mercifully, I burst out of the tree line and back onto the road where I'd left my patrol car. I scrambled inside, slamming the door and locking it. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I peeled away, tires squealing, I risked one last glance in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a pair of those lifeless eyes staring out at me from the shadows of the forest. Then they were gone. I drove straight back to the station, still shaking and gasping for breath. My colleagues were concerned when they saw the state I was in. Clothes torn, scratches on my face and arms, eyes wild with fear. But when I tried to explain what had happened, the words wouldn't come. How could I possibly describe what I'd experienced? They'd think I was crazy. Hell, maybe I was crazy. But I knew deep in my bones that what I'd encountered out there in those woods was real, and it was something far beyond human understanding. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd gotten spooked and let my imagination run wild. Maybe the old man had just been a confused hiker who'd wandered off. But no matter how I tried to explain it away, I couldn't shake the bone-deep terror I'd felt in those woods. I requested a transfer to a more urban precinct soon after. I couldn't bear the thought of patrolling those forest roads again. Even now, years later, I can't look at a densely wooded area without feeling a chill run down my spine. Sometimes at night, I still hear that growl in my dreams. I wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, half expecting to see those empty eyes staring at me from the darkness of my bedroom. I don't know what's out there in the deep, dark places of the world, but I know now that there are ancient, unknowable things lurking just beyond the edges of our perception, things that we were never meant to encounter. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just catch a glimpse of them. A fleeting moment that shatters our understanding of reality and leaves us forever changed. I just hope I never have to face that presence in the woods again, because I'm not sure I'd survive a second encounter. It all started when my friend Asher suggested we go camping at this secluded beach spot he knew about. He said it was beautiful and peaceful, the perfect place to relax and unwind. 5 of us decided to go: me, Asher, Jake, Mia, and Chris. We were all excited for a few days of sun, sand, and starry nights around the campfire. The drive there was uneventful, just a few hours of us laughing and joking around in the car. When we arrived at the beach, I had to admit Asher was right. It was stunning. The sand was pristine, the water a crystal clear blue. And best of all, there wasn't another soul in sight. We had the whole place to ourselves. We set up our tents near the tree line, a short walk from the shore. The afternoon was spent swimming, tossing a frisbee around, and soaking up the sun. As evening approached, we got a campfire going and broke out some beers. Everything was perfect. That's when I first noticed him. I was walking back from grabbing another drink from the cooler when I spotted a figure standing at the edge of the trees, partially obscured by shadows. At first I thought it was one of my friends, but as I got closer I realized it was a stranger, a man I didn't recognize. He was just standing there, watching us. I nudged Asher and pointed the guy out. "Hey, do you see that guy over there, by the trees?" Asher squinted in that direction. "Yeah, I see him. Weird. I thought we had this place to ourselves." "Should we go say hi?" I asked uncertainly. Asher shrugged. "I guess so. Might as well be friendly." We walked over towards the man, waving in what we hoped was a welcoming manner. But as we got closer, he suddenly turned and disappeared into the trees. "Well, that was strange," I said, feeling uneasy. "Yeah, maybe he's just shy," Asher suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. We headed back to the group and told the others what we'd seen. Everyone agreed it was odd, but we tried to brush it off and enjoy the rest of our evening. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As night fell, we roasted marshmallows and told ghost stories around the fire. I kept glancing towards the tree line, half expecting to see that mysterious figure again, but there was nothing there but darkness. Eventually, we decided to turn in for the night. Mia and I were sharing a tent, with the guys in 2 other tents nearby. I zipped us in securely, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when I heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching on sand, circling our campsite. My eyes flew open and I lay frozen, straining my ears. The footsteps paused near our tent, then started again, moving between the tents. "Mia," I whispered urgently, shaking her awake. "Do you hear that?" She blinked groggily. "Hear what?" "Shh, listen." We both fell silent. The footsteps had stopped, but now I could hear the sound of someone breathing heavily just outside our tent. Mia's eyes widened in fear. We clutched each other's hands, hardly daring to breathe. Suddenly, a shadow fell across our tent, the silhouette of a man standing right outside. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he must be able to hear it. The shadow remained motionless for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, a hand reached out and brushed against the side of the tent. I had to clamp a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. Just as suddenly as it appeared, the shadow vanished. We heard footsteps retreating rapidly, then silence. Mia and I looked at each other, both trembling. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said shakily. "But I think it was that guy we saw earlier." We debated waking the others, but decided to wait until morning. Neither of us slept a wink for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun began to rise, we unzipped the tent and stumbled out. The guys emerged from their tents looking sleepy and confused by our panicked expressions. "What's going on?" Jake asked, yawning. We quickly filled them in on what had happened during the night. Their faces grew serious as they listened. "We need to get out of here," Chris said firmly. "This isn't right." No one argued. We hastily began packing up our gear, constantly glancing around for any sign of the mysterious man. That's when Asher let out a strangled cry. "Guys, look at this!" We hurried over to where he was standing, staring at something on the ground. There, clearly visible in the sand, was a line of footprints circling our campsite, exactly matching the path I'd heard in the night. But that wasn't the worst part. Leading away from our camp was a second set of footprints, small and delicate. Women's footprints. Those aren't from any of us," Mia said in a shaky voice. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the implications. There had been someone else here last night, someone we hadn't seen or heard, someone who had been watching us along with that man. We threw the rest of our things in the car and peeled out of there as fast as we could. The drive home was tense and silent. each of us lost in our own thoughts about what had happened. To this day, I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted. Was he just a homeless guy who happened to be in the area? A predator stalking potential victims? Or something even more sinister? And those second footprints, who did they belong to? Had there been someone else out there that we never saw? The thought makes my skin crawl. I've never been camping since that trip. The memory of that shadowy figure outside our tent, those mysterious footprints in the sand, it's all burned into my mind. Sometimes I still wake up in the night, heart racing, convinced I hear footsteps circling my house. I know it sounds crazy. Maybe we all just got spooked over nothing and let our imaginations run wild. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that we narrowly escaped something truly terrible that night. Whatever was out there in those woods, watching us, I don't think it had friendly intentions. So if you're planning a camping trip to a secluded beach, my advice is this: be aware of your surroundings. And if you get that prickly feeling of being watched, trust your instincts. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I had decided to take a solo trip to a remote beach town, needing some time away from the stress of work and city life. The first few days were perfect, lounging on nearly empty beaches, reading books in the shade of palm trees, and enjoying fresh seafood at little beachside restaurants. I felt myself unwinding and reconnecting with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. On the fourth night, I decided to go for a late-night swim. The moon was full and bright, casting a silvery glow across the gentle waves. The beach was completely deserted. I stripped down to my swim trunks and waded into the warm water, sighing contentedly as it enveloped me. I swam out further than I normally would, feeling confident and strong in the calm sea. The shoreline receded until it was just a distant strip of darkness. I floated on my back, gazing up at the vast expanse of stars above me. In that moment, I felt small, but also deeply connected to the natural world around me. That's when things took a terrifying turn. As I lazily paddled in place, enjoying the rocking motion of the waves, I suddenly felt something brush against my leg underwater. At first I dismissed it as seaweed or maybe a fish, but then I felt it again, firmer this time, almost like fingers trailing along my calf. My heart started to race. I told myself I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me in the dark water. But then I felt an unmistakable grip around my ankle, yanking me down hard. I thrashed in panic, my head going under for a moment before I managed to break the surface, coughing and sputtering. Whatever had grabbed me was gone, but I could have sworn I felt the water displacing around me, as if something large was moving beneath the surface. Adrenaline coursing through me, I started swimming frantically for shore. But the beach seemed impossibly far away now. My arms and legs felt leaden as terror gripped me. I kept imagining something reaching up from the depths to drag me down. About halfway to shore, I felt it again. Something solid bumping against my side, then wrapping around my waist. It felt almost human-like, but wrong somehow. Cold and slippery and impossibly strong. I screamed and fought wildly against the grip. For a horrifying moment, I felt myself being pulled down. Water filled my nose and mouth. In blind panic, I kicked and clawed my way free, not even sure how I managed it. The last stretch to shore was a blur of desperate strokes and ragged breathing. I half swam, half stumbled onto the beach, collapsing onto the sand. For several minutes, I just lay there trembling, too afraid to even look back at the water. When I finally gathered the courage to sit up and peer out at the ocean, The surface was calm and innocent-looking in the moonlight. There was no sign of anything unusual. I told myself it must have been a rogue wave, or maybe I had gotten tangled in some fishing line or netting. The alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. I made my way back to my rental house on shaky legs, immediately jumping in the shower to rinse off the salt water. As the hot water poured over me, I noticed angry red marks around my ankle and waist, almost like suction marks or the imprint of strong fingers. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the water temperature. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with possibilities both rational and fantastical. By morning, I had almost convinced myself it was all a product of an overactive imagination combined with swimming alone at night. The marks on my body had faded significantly, which I took as further proof I had blown things out of proportion. But over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At first, I chalked it up to lingering nerves from my scare in the ocean. But it persisted even when I was away from the beach, walking around town or sitting in cafes. The hairs on the back of my neck would stand up for no apparent reason. I'd catch fleeting glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, only to turn and see nothing there. I started having vivid nightmares of being dragged into murky depths by shadowy tentacles. I'd wake up gasping for air, sheets tangled around me like seaweed. During the day, I felt jumpy and on edge. I stopped going to the beach altogether, content to view the ocean from the safety of my rental's porch. On my second-to-last day, I decided I was being ridiculous. I was determined to confront my newfound fear of the water before leaving. I forced myself to take a walk along the shoreline as the sun was setting, staying well away from the waterline. As dusk fell, the beach emptied out except for a few distant figures. I was working up the courage to at least wade in ankle-deep when movement in the waves caught my eye. At first I thought it was a seal or perhaps a dolphin, but as I squinted into the gathering darkness, my blood ran cold. There, just beyond where the waves were breaking, I saw what looked like a human head and shoulders emerging from the water. But it was too large to be a person, and there was something off about the proportions. As I stared in shock, it seemed to turn and look directly at me. I couldn't make out any features in the low light, but I felt the weight of its gaze like a physical force. A primal fear gripped me. Without conscious thought, I found myself running full tilt down the beach, not stopping until I was safely locked inside my rental. I spent a sleepless night with all the lights on, jumping at every little sound. The next morning, I checked out early and drove straight to the airport, too shaken to even pack properly. I've spent the months since then trying to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I glimpsed some kind of rare marine animal. But deep down, I know what I experienced was real and defies logical explanation. I used to love the ocean, finding it calming and beautiful. Now the very thought of it fills me with dread. I can't shake the feeling that something is out there, watching and waiting. Something that doesn't belong to the world as we know it. I don't know if I'll ever be able to set foot on a beach again, let alone go in the water. All I know is that my encounter in those dark waves changed me forever, leaving me with a bone-deep fear of what might be lurking beneath the surface of our world. We'd heard rumors about an abandoned cottage on a secluded stretch of beach about an hour from our hometown. Being the adventurous and admittedly stupid college kids we were, we decided to check it out one weekend. The drive there was full of excitement and jokes about ghosts, none of us actually believing we'd encounter anything out of the ordinary. When we first pulled up to the cottage, I felt an immediate sense of unease. The weathered wooden structure loomed before us, paint peeling and windows boarded up. The surrounding overgrown vegetation made it clear no one had lived there in years. But being young and eager to explore, we pushed aside our hesitations and approached the front door. It took some effort, but Jacob managed to pry the door open. The interior was dark and musty, with cobwebs everywhere and a thick layer of dust coating every surface. We used our phone flashlights to look around, finding mostly old, broken furniture and debris. Madison suggested we check out the basement, and that's when things started to get weird. The basement stairs creaked ominously as we descended. The air felt heavier down there, almost oppressive. In the beam of our flashlights, we spotted an old trunk tucked away in the corner. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to open it. Inside, we found a collection of faded photographs and letters. The photos showed a family, a stern-looking man, a woman with sad eyes, and 2 young children. The letters were mostly mundane correspondence, but a few hinted at some kind of family tragedy. We spent a while poring over the documents, trying to piece together the story of the people who once lived here. As the sun began to set, we realized we should head back upstairs. But when Jacob tried the basement door, it wouldn't budge. We all took turns trying to open it, but it was like it had been sealed shut. That's when the panic started to set in. We tried calling for help, but there was no cell signal in the basement. As night fell, the temperature seemed to drop dramatically. We huddled together for warmth, using our dying phone batteries sparingly to conserve light. That's when we started hearing the whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but they became clearer over time. Indistinct at first, but gradually forming into words we could almost understand. The voices sounded pained, pleading. Madison was the first to see her. She let out a blood-curdling scream that made Jacob and I jump. Following her terrified gaze, we saw a ghostly female figure floating near the stairs. She was translucent, with long, flowing hair and a tattered dress. Her eyes were the most unsettling part, filled with a profound sadness that chilled me to my core. We were paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. The apparition drifted closer, and I could feel the temperature drop even further. When she spoke, her voice echoed as if coming from far away. "Help us," she pleaded. "We've been trapped here for so long. You must destroy the documents to set us free." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This couldn't be real, right? Ghosts aren't real. But as I looked at the terror on my friends' faces, I knew we were all experiencing the same thing. The ghost gestured towards the trunk of documents we'd been looking through earlier. "Burn them," she insisted. "It's the only way to break the curse and free our spirits." Part of me wanted to refuse, to deny this was happening. But the desperation in her voice was palpable. Against my better judgment, I nodded. With shaking hands, we gathered the photos and letters from the trunk. Jacob had a lighter in his pocket, and we used it to set the pile ablaze. As the flames consumed the documents, the whispers around us grew louder, more frantic. The ghost woman smiled at us, a look of relief washing over her spectral features. "Thank you," she whispered, before fading away. As the last of the documents turned to ash, a powerful gust of wind swept through the basement, extinguishing our small fire. The temperature suddenly returned to normal, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. To our amazement, we heard a click, and the basement door swung open on its own. We didn't waste any time. We bolted up the stairs and out of the cottage as fast as our legs could carry us. Once we were safely in the car and speeding away from that cursed place, We tried to process what had just happened. None of us could explain it rationally. We'd experienced something beyond our understanding, something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the world. In the days and weeks that followed, we researched the history of the cottage and the family who lived there. We discovered a tragic story of abuse, murder, and suicide that had been covered up decades ago. It seemed that by destroying those documents, we had finally allowed the truth to come to light and set those tortured spirits free. To this day, I can't drive past a beach without thinking about that night. The image of that ghostly woman and the sound of those whispers are forever etched in my memory. I've never experienced anything like it since, and part of me hopes I never will again. But another part of me is grateful for the reminder that there's more to this world than we can explain, and sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. It was late September, and my best friend Julia had convinced me to take a last-minute trip to a small coastal town. The weather will still be nice, but it'll be way less crowded, she'd said. I was hesitant at first. I'm not really a beach person, but Julia can be pretty persuasive when she wants to be. So there we were, driving down a winding road with the windows down, salty air whipping through our hair. The town was exactly as Julia had described, quaint and sleepy, with most of the tourist shops already closed for the season. We checked into our little beachfront motel and headed straight for the sand. Julia was right about one thing. We practically had the whole beach to ourselves. Just a few elderly couples strolling along the water's edge and a group of seagulls squabbling over something in the sand. As we spread out our towels, I noticed a lone figure standing at the lifeguard tower, scanning the waves. It struck me as odd, since the tower looked pretty worn down, and I figured the lifeguards would be done for the season. But there he was, tall and tan, with sun-bleached hair. Classic lifeguard look. "Hey, Jules, is it normal for there to still be lifeguards this late in the year?" I asked. She squinted towards the tower. "Huh, that is kinda weird. Maybe they keep one on duty for stragglers like us?" I shrugged it off and tried to relax, but I kept finding my eyes drawn back to that solitary figure. There was something off about him. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. We spent the afternoon lazing on the beach, walking along the shore and splashing in the waves. Every so often I'd glance back at the lifeguard tower. Sometimes the guy was there, sometimes he wasn't. But whenever I did see him, he seemed to be staring intently out at the water. As the sun started to set, Julia and I decided to head back to our motel to clean up before dinner. Just as we were gathering our things, we heard shouting coming from down the beach. An older man was thrashing in the water, clearly caught in some kind of riptide or undercurrent. His wife was on the shore, screaming for help. Before I could even process what was happening, I saw a blur of motion out of the corner of my eye. It was the lifeguard sprinting towards the water at an inhuman speed. He dove into the waves and swam out to the struggling man with powerful, practiced strokes. Julia and I stood frozen, watching the rescue unfold. The lifeguard reached the man in seconds, wrapping an arm around his chest and swimming back toward shore. As they got closer, I could see the older man coughing and sputtering, but alive. They stumbled out of the surf, the lifeguard supporting the man's weight. He gently lowered him onto the sand, where the man's wife immediately rushed to his side. Julia and I hurried over, asking if we could help or if we should call an ambulance. The older couple assured us they were okay, just shaken up. The man couldn't stop thanking the lifeguard, saying over and over, "You saved my life, son. I don't know how to repay you." But when we all turned to look at the lifeguard, he was gone, vanished as if into thin air. There weren't even any wet footprints leading away from where he'd been standing moments before. We all looked at each other in confusion. The old man's wife spoke up, her voice trembling. Did you girls see him too? The lifeguard?" We nodded, and I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. Something very strange was going on. That night at dinner, Julia and I couldn't stop talking about what we'd witnessed. "Maybe he just ran off really fast after making sure the guy was okay," Julia suggested, but she didn't sound convinced. "I don't know," I said, pushing my food around my plate. There was definitely something different about him. "Did you notice how fast he got to the water? It was like inhumanly fast." We decided to do some digging. The next morning we went to the local library and asked if we could look at old newspapers. The librarian, a kind older woman, asked what we were researching. We're just curious about the history of the beach," I said, trying to sound casual. "Specifically the lifeguards. We saw one yesterday who was really impressive." The librarian's face changed, a look of sadness passing over her features. "Oh my, you must be talking about Christopher." Julia and I exchanged glances. "Christopher?" I asked. The librarian nodded, pulling out a dusty folder of old newspaper clippings. "Christopher Evans. He was a lifeguard here for many years, saved countless lives, until—" She trailed off, then handed us a yellowed newspaper article. The headline read, "Local hero dies saving drowning child." My blood ran cold as I read the article. Christopher Evans, 32, had drowned while rescuing a young boy from a dangerous rip current. His body was never recovered. The date on the newspaper? September 25th, 1985. "But that's impossible," Julia whispered. "We saw him yesterday. He saved that man." The librarian gave us a knowing look. "You're not the first to say that, dears. For years now, people have reported seeing a mysterious lifeguard on that beach. Always during the off-season, always saving someone from drowning, and always disappearing right after." I felt like the floor was tilting beneath me. This couldn't be real, and yet I knew what I'd seen with my own eyes. We spent the rest of the day in a daze, walking up and down the beach. I kept expecting, hoping, dreading to see Christopher again, but the lifeguard tower remained empty. As the sun began to set, Julia and I found ourselves sitting on the sand, staring out at the waves. Neither of us had said much for hours. What was there to say? We'd witnessed something that defied explanation. Suddenly, Julia gasped and grabbed my arm. "Look!" she hissed, pointing down the beach. There, barely visible in the fading light, was a figure standing at the water's edge, tall, muscular, with that unmistakable sun-bleached hair. He was looking right at us. I felt my heart pounding in my chest as we slowly stood up. The figure, Christopher, raised his hand in a small wave. Then, to my amazement, he began walking towards us. Every instinct told me to run, but I found myself rooted to the spot. As he got closer, I could make out more details. He looked solid, real, not at all how I'd imagine a ghost would look, but there was a sort of shimmer around him, like heat rising off hot pavement. He stopped a few feet away from us, a gentle smile on his face. "Beautiful sunset, isn't it?" he said, his voice warm and slightly raspy. Julia and I just stared, open-mouthed. Finally, I managed to stammer out, Are you real?" Christopher's smile turned sad. "As real as the sand beneath your feet, as real as the waves crashing on the shore, as real as the lives I've sworn to protect. But you're—" I couldn't bring myself to say the word dead. He nodded, understanding. "My physical body may be gone, but my spirit, my purpose, That remains. I made a vow to protect this beach and the people who come here. Death doesn't change that. I had a million questions, but all I could manage was a whispered why. Christopher looked out at the ocean, his eyes distant. Because it's who I am. It's who I've always been. I couldn't rest knowing that people might be in danger, that I could help them. He turned back to us, his gaze intense. Life is precious, every single one. I learned that in my final moments as I fought to save that little boy. And I'll keep fighting, keep saving, for as long as I'm needed. We stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle lapping of waves on the shore. Then Christopher spoke again, his voice softer. I know this is a lot to take in, but I hope you understand now why it's important to keep this beach safe, even in the off-season, even when no one thinks anyone is watching. I felt tears pricking at my eyes. We understand, I said, and we won't tell anyone about you. Your secret is safe with us. Christopher smiled, a look of relief passing over his face. Thank you. Now, if you'll excuse me, duty calls. He gestured out towards the water, where I suddenly noticed a small boat that seemed to be struggling against the current. In the blink of an eye, Christopher was gone, sprinting towards the water with that same impossible speed we'd seen before. Julia and I watched in awe as he swam out to the boat, guiding it safely back to shore. As the grateful boaters climbed onto the beach, we looked for Christopher. But just like before, he had vanished without a trace. Julia and I spent the rest of our vacation in a sort of daze, processing what we'd experienced. We'd go to the beach every day, sometimes catching glimpses of Christopher patrolling the shoreline or helping a swimmer in distress. But he never approached us again. On our last day, as we were packing up the car, I took one final walk down to the water's edge. As I stood there, toes sinking into the wet sand, I whispered a quiet thank you to the wind and waves. I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper in return. Stay safe. We drove home in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. I know Julia and I will never forget what we saw on that beach. It's changed the way I look at the world, at life and death, at the very nature of heroism and dedication. Sometimes on stormy nights, I find myself thinking about Christopher, wondering if he's out there on that lonely beach, still watching over the waves. And I feel a sense of comfort, knowing that there are forces in this world, seen and unseen, looking out for us, protecting us, even when we don't realize it. I may never fully understand what happened during that week at the beach, but I do know this. There are more things in heaven and earth than we can ever truly comprehend. And sometimes, just sometimes, we're lucky enough to catch a glimpse of them. Started small at first, just little things I could easily brush off. The horses seemed more skittish than usual, whinnying nervously for no apparent reason. I'd hear faint footsteps when I knew I was alone, only to find nothing when I looked. But as the days went on, things escalated in ways I couldn't ignore. One evening, as I was finishing up my chores, I heard the strangest music drifting from the barn. It was eerie and old-fashioned, like something from an antique music box. My skin prickled as I approached, trying to find the source. But as soon as I stepped inside, it stopped abruptly. The silence felt heavy and unnatural. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to get the melody out of my head. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures and whispered voices. The next day, I was determined to get to the bottom of things. I spent extra time in the barn, meticulously going through every nook and cranny. As I climbed up to the hayloft, the floorboards creaked ominously under my feet. The air felt thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. Suddenly, I felt it, an icy cold hand gripping my shoulder. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just empty air and dancing dust motes in the fading sunlight. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the shadows, a tall, dark figure, there for just a split second before vanishing. I scrambled down the ladder so fast I nearly fell, running out of the barn at full speed. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely open the door to the house. My parents found me in the kitchen, white as a sheet, and babbling about what I'd seen. Of course they didn't believe me. Dad said I was just working too hard in the heat, and Mom suggested I was letting my imagination run wild. They tried to humor me, but I could see the concern in their eyes. I knew they thought I was losing it. But the incidents kept happening. Night after night, I'd wake up to that same haunting melody drifting through my open window. I'd see fleeting shadows pass by, gone before I could focus on them. The temperatures would plummet in certain spots around the farm, even on the hottest summer days. My family couldn't ignore it forever. One night, we all jolted awake to the sound of the horses in a panic, whinnying and kicking at their stalls. When we ran out to check, we found the barn doors wide open, swinging in a wind that wasn't there. As we stood there in shock, that's when we all heard it, the music, louder than ever before. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, and there, silhouetted in the barn doorway, was a tall figure in old-fashioned clothes. We all saw it clear as day, before it simply faded away like mist. That was enough for my parents to finally take action. They called the sheriff the next day, but of course he found nothing out of the ordinary. No sign of intruders, no logical explanation for what we'd all witnessed. He chalked it up to an overactive imagination and some local pranksters, but I could see in his eyes that even he wasn't fully convinced. The activity seemed to die down after that, but the damage was done. I couldn't sleep without nightmares, jumping at every little sound. I begged my parents to let me stay with my aunt in town, anything to get away from that barn. They reluctantly agreed, probably hoping some time away would help me snap out of it. But even years later, I can't shake the memories of that summer. The cold touch on my shoulder, the figure in the doorway, that haunting melody. It's all seared into my brain. I've never been able to step foot in a barn since without breaking into a cold sweat. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just stress or an overactive imagination. But deep down, I know what I experienced was real. Something was in that barn, something old and not of this world. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that faint, ghostly music drifting on the breeze. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, half the time I don't even believe myself. But I needed to get this off my chest, to finally tell someone what really happened that summer. Maybe then I can start to move past it, to finally lay those ghosts to rest. But a part of me knows I'll never truly be free of that old barn and the horrors it held. The worst part is not knowing why it happened. Was our farm built on some ancient burial ground? Was there some tragic event in the barn's history we never knew about? Or did we just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, when the veil between worlds was thin? I've done research since then, trying to find any history of hauntings or strange occurrences in the area. But there's nothing. No local legends, no tragic accidents, nothing that would explain what we experienced. It's like it came out of nowhere, targeted our family for a few terrifying months, and then vanished just as mysteriously. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, waiting. If I went back to that farm now, would it all start up again? Or has it moved on to torment some other unsuspecting family? The not knowing is almost worse than the memories themselves. I've tried therapy, meditation, even medication to try and put it behind me, but nothing seems to help. Those experiences changed me fundamentally, altered the way I see the world. I can't look at an old building without wondering what secrets it might hold. Every unexpected sound makes me freeze, waiting for that eerie music to start up again. My family doesn't talk about it anymore. It's like we've all made an unspoken agreement to pretend it never happened. But I see it in their eyes sometimes. That same haunted look I know is in mine. We're all carrying those memories, those unexplainable events that shook our understanding of reality. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from that summer. The trauma runs deep, coloring every aspect of my life. I've missed out on so many normal experiences, camping trips, haunted houses at Halloween, even just being alone in dark or unfamiliar places. That constant fear, that feeling of being watched, never really goes away. But I'm trying to move forward, to reclaim my life from the shadows of the past. Writing this all out has been therapeutic in a way, finally giving voice to the terror I've carried for so long. Maybe by sharing my story, I can start to let go of some of the fear and find a way to live with the uncertainty. To anyone reading this who's experienced something similar, you're not alone. And to those who haven't, count yourselves lucky. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that can shake you to your very core. All we can do is try to hold on to our sanity and support each other through the darkness. I don't know if I'll ever return to that farm, to face the barn that haunts my nightmares. Part of me wants to prove to myself that it was all in my head. But a bigger part is terrified of what I might find, or what might find me. For now, I'll carry these memories with me, a constant reminder of the summer that changed everything. And I'll keep hoping that someday, somehow, I'll find the answers I've been seeking for so long. It was a charming old farmhouse on 10 acres, with a big red barn and rolling green fields as far as the eye could see. The first few weeks were absolute bliss. We'd wake up to birds chirping, have our morning coffee on the porch, and spend our evenings stargazing. It felt like we'd found our own little slice of paradise. But then strange things started happening. At first, it was just little things that were easy to brush off. I'd come home and swear I saw a shadowy figure dart behind the barn, but when I went to look, there was no one there. Or we'd hear what sounded like footsteps in the attic at night, but we chalked it up to old house noises. Things started to get more unsettling about a month after we moved in. One night we were jolted awake by loud banging on the front door. I grabbed a baseball bat and went to check, but there was no one there. Just darkness and silence. As I was about to head back inside, I noticed muddy footprints on the porch that definitely weren't ours. After that, it seemed like weird stuff was happening almost daily. We'd find doors we knew we'd locked standing wide open. Things would go missing, nothing valuable, just random items like a spatula from the kitchen or one of Emily's hair ties. One day, I came home to find all the kitchen chairs stacked in a tower in the middle of the room. We started to feel like we were losing our minds. We'd double and triple check that everything was locked up tight before bed, but still wake up to find windows open or items moved around. I installed security cameras, but they never seemed to catch anything definitive, just occasional blurry shadows or static. The police came out a few times, but they never found any evidence of an intruder. They suggested it might be local teens playing pranks, but that didn't explain how someone was getting inside when everything was locked up. We started to wonder if the house was haunted, even though neither of us really believed in that stuff. Things came to a head about 2 months ago. I woke up in the middle of the night to get a glass of water and noticed the barn door was open, swaying slightly in the breeze. I knew for a fact I'd latched it earlier that evening. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and my baseball bat and crept out to investigate. As I approached the barn, I heard shuffling noises coming from inside. I shone my light through the doorway and caught a glimpse of someone ducking behind some hay bales. "Hey!" I shouted. "I can see you! Come out now!" There was a moment of tense silence. Then suddenly a figure burst out from behind the bales and rushed past me into the night. It happened so fast I barely got a look, but it was definitely a person, tall and thin, wearing dark clothes. I chased after them, but they disappeared into the woods at the edge of our property. Shaken, I went back inside and woke Emily. We called the police again, and this time they found clear evidence someone had been living in our barn. There was a makeshift bed, some food wrappers, and disturbingly, a collection of small items taken from our house, everything from pencils to family photos. We were completely freaked out. The police increased patrols in the area, but the intruder was never caught. We seriously considered selling the house and moving back to the city, but we'd put all our savings into this place, and the idea of giving up on our dream because of some creep infuriated us. So we decided to fight back. We got a large dog, installed better security systems, and I even set up some traps around the property. For a while, things seemed to calm down. We'd still occasionally hear strange noises or find things slightly out of place, but nothing as blatant as before. Just when we thought maybe it was over, it all came to a terrifying climax. About 3 weeks ago, Emily and I were watching a movie late one night when the power suddenly cut out. I went to check the breaker box in the basement, and as I was heading back upstairs, I heard Emily scream. I ran to the living room and found her backed into a corner, staring wide-eyed at something behind me. I whirled around, and there he was, the intruder, standing in our kitchen doorway. He was rail-thin and dirty, with long matted hair and wild eyes. For a moment we all just froze, staring at each other in shock. Then he spoke, in a raspy voice that made my skin crawl. "This is my home. You need to leave." Before I could react, he turned and bolted out the back door. I chased after him, but once again he vanished into the darkness. We called the police yet again, but as usual, they found nothing. We were beside ourselves with fear and frustration. How long had this man been living on our property, watching us, coming into our home? The sense of violation was overwhelming. In the days that followed, we took drastic measures. We stayed with friends for a week while a security company basically turned our property into Fort Knox. We cleared out all the overgrown areas where someone could hide. We even hired a private investigator to look into the history of the property, wondering if maybe this guy was a former owner or something. It's been almost a month now since that night, and things have been quiet. Too quiet almost. Sometimes I still feel like I catch glimpses of someone watching from the woods, but it could just be my paranoia. Emily and I are jumpy and on edge all the time. Our dream home has become a source of constant stress and fear. We don't know what to do. Part of me still loves this place and doesn't want to give it up. But how can we ever feel safe here again? Will we spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, wondering if he's out there watching us? The police seem to have given up, and we're at our wits' end. I'm sharing this story partly as a warning to others, and partly in hopes that maybe someone out there has dealt with something similar and has advice. We're living a real-life nightmare, and I'm not sure how much longer we can take it. Our little slice of paradise has become a prison of fear, and I don't know if we'll ever feel truly at peace here again.